I never thought I'd see the day when my own flesh and blood would try to take everything from me in a court of law. But there I was, 63 years old, standing in a marble hallway outside a courtroom in downtown Philadelphia, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my purse. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps, and the smell of floor polish and stale coffee made my stomach turn. I'd spent 40 years of my life loving people who didn't love me back, and now I was about to face the worst betrayal of all. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world where family still means something, I need you to know, this story isn't just mine. It's for everyone who's ever been thrown away like garbage by the people they sacrificed everything for. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, you need to hear what happened next. So hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty, love, and revenge. And please, check the description box below. There are more stories like mine there, stories about people who refuse to stay silent. My name is Eleanor Ruth Patterson, and the man I buried 3 months ago left me a fortune I never asked for. Richard Patterson was 71 when his heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in our master bathroom, his face pressed against the cold tile, his eyes still open like he was surprised death had finally caught up with him. We'd been married for 42 years. 42 years of sleeping in the same bed, eating breakfast across from each other, attending charity galas where he'd introduce me as my wife like I was a piece of furniture he'd acquired decades ago and forgotten the purpose of. I loved him. God help me. I loved him even though he was never really mine. Richard Patterson built an empire in commercial real estate, turning abandoned warehouses into luxury condos, buying up entire city blocks before anyone else saw their potential. He was brilliant in business and cold as January in everything else. When he died, his lawyers told me he'd left me everything: the houses, the investments, the liquid assets totaling somewhere around $37 million. I sat in that lawyer's office on Walnut Street, surrounded by mahogany and leather and the kind of quiet that only money can buy, and I felt absolutely nothing. Because the money didn't matter. What mattered was that for 42 years, I'd been a ghost in my own life, and now that Richard was gone, I thought maybe, just maybe, I could finally breathe. I should have known better. I should have known that money doesn't just sit quietly in bank accounts. It screams. It demands. It turns people into monsters. My son, Daniel, was 39 years old when his father died, and he hadn't spoken to me, really spoken to me, in over 15 years. Oh, he'd show up for Christmas sometimes, always late, always with that tight smile that never reached his eyes. He'd married a woman named Veronica 6 years ago, a corporate attorney with sharp cheekbones and sharper ambitions, the kind of woman who looked at me like I was something she'd stepped in. They lived in a glass and steel house in Rittenhouse Square, the kind of place that appeared in architecture magazines, all clean lines and no warmth. Daniel looked like his father, same strong jaw, same cold blue eyes, same way of looking through people instead of at them. But where Richard had at least tried to be decent in his own distant way, Daniel had perfected cruelty as an art form. He blamed me for everything wrong in his life, though he'd never say it directly. It was all in the silences, the way he'd flinch when I tried to hug him, the way he'd check his watch whenever I spoke at family gatherings. When Richard died, Daniel didn't cry at the funeral. He stood beside me at the graveside, his hand briefly touching my shoulder in what anyone else might have thought was comfort, and whispered, "We need to talk about Dad's estate." Not "I'm sorry for your loss, Mom." Not "Are you okay?" Just business. Always business. I should have seen it coming. I should have prepared myself. But grief makes you stupid, makes you hope for things that died a long time ago. 3 weeks after the funeral, Daniel and Veronica invited me to dinner at their house. I remember driving there in Richard's old Mercedes, my Mercedes now, I kept having to remind myself, and feeling this flutter of something that might have been hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe Richard's death had shaken something loose in Daniel, made him realize that life was short and forgiveness was possible. I wore the navy dress Richard always said made me look elegant, though he'd stopped noticing what I wore years ago. I brought a homemade apple pie, Daniel's favorite when he was a boy, back when he still looked at me like I was the center of his universe. The drive from our house in Chestnut Hill took 23 minutes, and I spent every one of them practicing what I'd say if Daniel finally gave me the chance to explain things. To make him understand. Their house was cold when I stepped inside. Not literally, the heating worked fine, but there was something Arctic in the air, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Veronica answered the door in all white, like she was trying to communicate her purity, her superiority. She looked at the pie in my hands and said, "Oh, you didn't need to bring anything." But the way she said it made it clear that what I'd brought wasn't good enough, had never been good enough, would never be good enough. Daniel was in the living room, standing by those floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city lights. He didn't turn around when I walked in. Veronica gestured toward a white leather chair that looked like it had never been sat in, and I perched on the edge of it, holding my purse in my lap like a shield. "Mom," Daniel said, still not looking at me, "we need to discuss Dad's will." My stomach dropped. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was never about reconciliation. "Your father left everything to me," I said quietly. "His lawyers were very clear about that." Now Daniel turned, and the look on his face was pure contempt. Dad wasn't in his right mind those last few years. Everyone knew it. The medications, the stress, he wasn't making sound decisions. I felt something cold spreading through my chest. Your father's mind was perfectly sound. He knew exactly what he was doing. Veronica sat down across from me, crossing her legs with the precision of someone who'd studied body language in law school. "Eleanor," she said, and I hated how she used my first name like we were friends, like she had any right to that familiarity. "We're not trying to hurt you. We just want what's fair. Daniel is Richard's only child. Surely you can see how inappropriate it is that you inherited everything." Inappropriate. That word hung in the air like poison gas. "I was his wife for 42 years, I said, and my voice came out stronger than I expected. "I earned every penny of that money." Daniel laughed. Actually laughed. It was a harsh, bitter sound that didn't belong in a living room that expensive. "Earned it? By what, Mom? By hosting dinner parties? By spending his money on charity committees? You didn't build his business. You were just—" He stopped himself, but I knew what he was going to say. "Just decoration. Just a wife. Just nothing." "Your father wanted me to have it," I said, standing up. The room tilted slightly, and I realized I was shaking. "And I'm not giving you a single penny." Veronica's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Something calculating. "We were hoping to handle this civilly," she said. "But if you're going to be difficult, we'll have to explore other options." I left the pie on their expensive coffee table and walked out. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the car key in the ignition. I sat there in their circular driveway, surrounded by my new neighborhood's ambient glow of wealth and power, and I knew, that this was just the beginning. If you've ever had your own child look at you with pure hatred, you know what I felt in that moment. If you've ever realized that all your sacrifices, all your love, all your years of trying meant absolutely nothing to someone you'd have died for, you know why I couldn't sleep that night, or the next night, or the night after that. Stay with me, because what happened next showed me exactly what my son was capable of. And trust me, you won't see it coming. The lawsuit arrived on a Thursday morning in late October, delivered by a process server who looked like he felt sorry for me. The envelope was thick and official, and when I opened it at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd served Richard breakfast every morning for 4 decades, the words swam in front of my eyes. Suit to contest will. Undue influence. Mental incapacity. Rightful heir. Daniel was suing me. My son, the boy I'd carried for 9 months, the baby I'd nursed through colic and croup, the child I'd driven to soccer practice and piano lessons and debate tournaments, was taking me to court to steal his dead father's money. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too bright, too full of memories. I remembered Daniel at 7, standing on a chair at this very table, helping me frost Christmas cookies, his small hands covered in green icing. I remembered him at 13, sullen and angry about something I never understood, refusing to look at me during breakfast. I remembered him at 25, bringing Veronica home for the first time, and the way he'd pulled away when I tried to kiss his cheek hello. When had I lost him? Was it gradual, like a river wearing away stone, or was there a specific moment when he stopped being mine? I called Richard's lawyer, a man named Gregory Thornton who'd been managing Richard's affairs for 30 years. He had that old-money Philadelphia accent, all subtle vowels and expensive education, and when I told him about the lawsuit, he was quiet for so long I thought the line had gone dead. "Mrs. Patterson," he finally said, "I need you to understand something. Cases like this, contested wills, especially involving large estates, they get ugly. Very ugly. Your son will try to prove you manipulated Richard, that you took advantage of an elderly man. They'll dig into your marriage, your history, everything. But Richard was perfectly competent, I said. My voice sounded small, childlike. I hated it. He made these decisions himself. You were there. You witnessed it. I know that. You know that. But in court, it's about what we can prove, and more importantly, it's about what kind of story the other side can tell. They'll paint you as a gold digger who married Richard for his money and spent 40 years waiting for him to die. I thought about my wedding day, how young I'd been. 21 years old in a white dress from Wanamaker's, marrying a man I barely knew because he was handsome and successful and because my mother said I'd be crazy to let him slip away. I thought about the early years, when I tried so hard to make Richard love me, to make myself indispensable. I thought about getting pregnant with Daniel, how I'd hoped a baby would soften Richard, bring us closer. It hadn't worked. Richard loved Daniel in his way, but it was a distant, transactional love. He provided. He protected. He planned for the future. But he didn't know how to be warm, how to be present, how to show up for soccer games and school plays. That was my job. I was the one who did the emotional labor, the daily grind of parenting, while Richard built his empire. And Daniel had hated me for it. Somehow, in his child's mind and then his adult's mind, I was the problem. I was too much, too emotional, too needy, too present. Richard's absence became noble in Daniel's eyes, something to aspire to, while my constant presence became suffocating, shameful. What do I do? I asked Gregory. You fight, he said. You hire the best litigation attorney money can buy, and you fight. Because if you don't, Eleanor, your son will take everything Richard left you, and you'll spend your old age in a one-bedroom apartment, living on whatever social security you've managed to accumulate. After I hung up, I sat at that kitchen table for 3 hours. The afternoon light moved across the floor, turning from gold to grey to darkness, and I didn't move. I kept thinking about the day Daniel was born, how they'd placed him in my arms and I'd counted his fingers, his toes, checked every inch of him to make sure he was perfect. He'd been perfect. So perfect. And I'd promised him, right there in that hospital room with the fluorescent lights and the smell of disinfectant, that I would always protect him, always love him, always put him first. I'd kept that promise. Even when it hurt. Even when Richard worked late and I ate dinner alone. Even when Daniel started pulling away and I didn't understand why. Even when he moved across the country for college and barely called. Even when he came back and married Veronica and stopped pretending to care. I'd kept that promise, and this was how he repaid me. Something hardened in my chest that night, something that felt like ice crystallizing around my heart. I'd spent my entire life being soft, being accommodating, being the peacemaker. I'd absorbed everyone else's anger, everyone else's disappointment, everyone else's cruelty, and I'd smiled and apologized and tried harder. Not anymore. If Daniel wanted a war, I'd give him a war. But I wouldn't fight the way he expected. I'd spent 40 years being underestimated, being dismissed, being treated like I was simple and decorative and useless. That was going to be my weapon. Because here's what Daniel didn't know, what Veronica didn't know, what even Gregory Thornton didn't know. I wasn't just Richard Patterson's wife. I was the woman who'd kept Richard Patterson's secrets for 4 decades. I was the woman who knew where the bodies were buried, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively. And I was done protecting people who'd never protected me. I spent that night in Richard's study, going through his files. Richard was old school. He kept paper records of everything, even after the world went digital. Bank statements, contracts, letters, photographs, all meticulously organized in filing cabinets that lined one wall. I'd never looked through them before. It felt like a violation, like reading someone's diary. But Richard was dead, and Daniel was trying to destroy me, and I was past the point of respecting anyone's privacy. What I found in those files changed everything. Richard hadn't been the man I thought he was. Or maybe he'd been exactly the man I'd suspected but never wanted to confirm. There were payments to women whose names I didn't recognize. There were shell companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. There were contracts that looked legitimate until you read the fine print and realized they were skirting the edge of legality, sometimes crossing that edge entirely. And there were letters. God, the letters. Women writing to Richard, thanking him for his generosity, for his discretion. Some of the letters were old, yellowed with age. Some were recent, printed from emails. I recognized some of the names, women from the charity circuit, younger women with impressive credentials and hungry eyes. I read every single letter. It took me all night. When the sun came up, I was still sitting at Richard's desk, surrounded by evidence of a life I'd been married to but never really part of. I felt numb. Not angry, not hurt, those emotions would come later. Just numb. Richard had left me everything because he felt guilty. That's what it came down to. He knew he'd been a terrible husband, knew he'd left me alone in our marriage while he'd built his fortune and had his discreet affairs. The money was his way of apologizing without ever having to say the words. And Daniel thought I didn't deserve it. Daniel thought I'd somehow tricked his father, manipulated a brilliant businessman into leaving me his estate. Daniel had no idea what I'd actually lived through, what I'd actually endured. But he was about to find out. I called Gregory Thornton at 8 in the morning, probably waking him up. I need you to recommend a litigation attorney, I said. The best one you know. Someone who understands how to hurt people where they live. There was a pause. Then, Eleanor, are you sure about this? Once you start down this road, there's no going back. Your relationship with your son is already gone, I finished. Has been gone for years. I just didn't want to admit it. Now I need someone who can help me protect what's mine and make sure Daniel regrets ever trying to take it from me. There's a woman named Barbara Reeves, Gregory said slowly. She's aggressive, brilliant, and expensive. She specializes in high net worth disputes, and she doesn't lose. I'll make the introduction. Do it, I said, and hung up. If you've ever reached a breaking point where you realize that being nice, being accommodating, being the bigger person had gotten you absolutely nowhere, you know what I felt that morning. Sometimes the only way forward is through the fire. And I was about to burn it all down. Barbara Reeves had an office in a skyscraper on Market Street, one of those buildings where you need a special elevator key just to reach the upper floors. I met her on a grey November morning, 2 weeks after the lawsuit landed in my mailbox like a bomb. The receptionist offered me coffee in a cup that probably cost more than my first car, and I sat in a waiting room decorated with abstract art that looked like someone had thrown paint at a canvas and called it genius. When Barbara finally emerged from her office, I understood immediately why Gregory had called her aggressive. She was maybe 45, tall and angular, with dark hair cut short and severe. She wore a black suit that screamed power, and when she shook my hand, her grip was firm enough to make a point. Her eyes were dark, assessing, and I had the distinct impression she'd already decided whether or not to take my case before I'd even sat down. Mrs. Patterson, she said, gesturing me into her office. The view overlooked the city, all the way to the Delaware River, and I wondered what it cost to have windows like that, to literally look down on the world from this height. Gregory tells me your son is contesting your husband's will. That's correct. I sat in the chair across from her massive desk, keeping my spine straight, my hands folded in my lap. I'd worn my most conservative outfit, black pantsuit, pearls, sensible heels. I wanted to look like what I was, a grieving widow who deserved protection, not a gold digger who'd manipulated her way into a fortune. Barbara settled into her chair and steepled her fingers, studying me like I was a particularly interesting specimen. Before we go any further, I need to understand something. Why did Richard leave everything to you? Not half to you and half to Daniel, not a trust fund for your son, but everything. That's unusual, even in long marriages. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. The moment where I either told the truth and risked looking weak, or lied and risked being caught in that lie later. I chose something in between. My husband was a complicated man, I said carefully. He built an empire, but he wasn't warm. He provided financially but not emotionally. He and Daniel had a distant relationship. Richard was proud of Daniel's accomplishments but never learned how to show affection. I think, toward the end of his life, Richard realized he'd failed as a father. He wanted to make amends, but he didn't know how to do it directly. The will was his way of ensuring I'd be taken care of, and I think he assumed I'd use some of that money to help Daniel eventually. But you're not planning to do that now. It wasn't a question. No, I said flatly. I'm not. Barbara leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing at her lips. Good. Nothing tanks a case faster than a client who's ambivalent about winning. Now, let's talk strategy. Your son's attorney, I'm assuming Veronica will handle this, or they'll hire someone similar, will argue that Richard wasn't competent to make the will, or that you exerted undue influence over him in his final years. They'll bring in expert witnesses to testify about his medical conditions, his medications, his mental state. They'll paint a picture of a vulnerable old man being manipulated by a scheming wife. Each word was like a slap, even though I'd expected them. Richard wasn't vulnerable. He was sharp until the day he died. I believe you. But court isn't about truth, it's about what we can prove and what story resonates with the judge. We need to build a counter-narrative. You weren't a gold digger. You were a devoted wife who sacrificed her own career and ambitions to support Richard's success. You raised his son essentially alone while Richard built his business. You were a partner in every sense except financially, and the will simply corrected that imbalance. I nodded slowly. This was the version of my life I'd been telling myself for years, the story that made the loneliness bearable. It was mostly true. Maybe completely true. I'd stopped being able to tell the difference. Here's what's going to happen, Barbara continued, pulling out a legal pad and making notes in sharp, efficient handwriting. Discovery is going to be brutal. They'll depose you, depose everyone who knew Richard, go through your financial records, your medical records, everything. They'll look for anything, any purchase that seems extravagant, any conflict you had with Richard, any time you might have seemed controlling or manipulative. They'll interview your friends, your neighbors, anyone who might say something damaging. I don't have many friends, I said quietly. It was embarrassing to admit, but true. 40 years of marriage to Richard had left me isolated. His circle was my circle, and after he died, those people evaporated like morning fog. That might actually help us, Barbara said, not unkindly. Harder for them to find people willing to say negative things. What about staff? Did you have household employees who might have witnessed your daily interactions with Richard? I thought about Maria, our housekeeper for 20 years, who'd left when Richard died because she couldn't bear to work in the house without him. I thought about James, Richard's driver, who was loyal to Richard's memory but had always been kind to me. A few, I said. But they were Richard's employees more than mine. I don't know whose side they take. We'll find out in Discovery. Now, the most important question. Are there any skeletons in your closet? Any affairs, any financial improprieties, any history of mental health issues they could exploit? I need to know everything now, before they find it themselves. I shook my head. No affairs. I was faithful to Richard even when he wasn't faithful to me. No financial problems, Richard controlled the money. I just spent what he gave me for household expenses. No mental health issues beyond some depression after Daniel pulled away, and I saw a therapist for that, paid in cash, no insurance records. Barbara's eyebrows rose slightly. Richard had affairs. This was it. The information I'd been holding close, the weapon I'd found in Richard's study. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder. I'd made copies of everything, left the originals exactly where I'd found them. I slid the folder across Barbara's desk. Richard kept meticulous records, I said, including records of his extramarital activities, payments to mistresses, hotel receipts, letters. There's also evidence of some questionable business dealings, nothing criminal, probably, but definitely ethically grey. Shell companies, off-book transactions, that sort of thing. Barbara opened the folder, her expression neutral as she flipped through the pages. But I saw something flicker in her eyes. Interest, maybe excitement. This was ammunition, and she knew it. Did Daniel know about any of this? She asked. I don't think so. Richard kept his private life very private. Daniel idolized his father, saw him as this titan of industry, this self-made man who built an empire through hard work and vision. If Daniel knew Richard was cheating on me, knew about the moral corners Richard cut in business, it might change how he thinks about the will. He might understand why Richard left everything to me, guilt, conscience, whatever you want to call it. Barbara closed the folder carefully, her mind clearly racing through possibilities. This changes things. If we can prove Richard's will was motivated by legitimate guilt over how he treated you, that actually strengthens your case. It shows his decision was rational, based on a clear understanding of his moral debts. And if Daniel pushes too hard, we can threaten to make all of this public. Rich men's families don't usually want their dirty laundry aired in court. I don't want to destroy Richard's reputation, I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. Despite everything, the affairs, the neglect, the emotional distance, I'd loved Richard. Or at least I'd loved the idea of him, the potential of what we could have been. But I won't let Daniel take what Richard wanted me to have. If making these documents public is what it takes to protect myself, I'll do it. Barbara smiled, and it was a predator's smile, all teeth and calculation. Mrs. Patterson, I think we're going to work very well together. My retainer is $50,000, and I bill at $800 per hour. Given the size of your estate and the complexity of this case, you're looking at probably $300,000 to $400,000 in legal fees before we're done. Can you handle that? I thought about the $37 million sitting in various accounts, earning interest, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. Yes, I said. I can handle it. Then let's destroy your son's case before it even gets to trial. We shook hands, and I left her office feeling something I hadn't felt in months, powerful. For the first time since Richard died, I wasn't just reacting to what was happening to me. I was taking control. I was fighting back. The war had begun, and I had no intention of losing. Over the next few weeks, Barbara and her team worked like surgical strike force, methodically building our defense while simultaneously preparing to go on offense if necessary. I met with them twice a week in that office with the expensive view, answering question after question about my marriage, my relationship with Daniel, my understanding of Richard's business. They deposed Gregory Thornton, who testified that Richard had been completely lucid when he'd updated his will 2 years before his death. They interviewed Richard's personal physician, Dr. Raymond Chen. Wait, I need to think of another name. Dr. Raymond Foster, who confirmed that while Richard had high blood pressure and early-stage heart disease, he had no cognitive impairments, no dementia, no conditions that would have affected his judgment. They went through 40 years of family photographs, building a narrative of a devoted wife and distant father. Pictures of me at Daniel's Little League games, me at his high school graduation, me standing alone at his college send-off because Richard had been too busy with a business deal to make the trip. Pictures of family holidays where Richard stood slightly apart, always holding a drink, always watching rather than participating. This is gold, Barbara said one afternoon, spreading the photographs across her conference table. This tells the story we need to tell. You were the parent. You were the one who showed up. Daniel pulling away from you wasn't about you being a bad mother. It was about him modeling his father's emotional unavailability. He learned from Richard that love meant providing material goods while maintaining emotional distance. And now he wants the material goods without acknowledging the emotional debt. I stared at a photograph of Daniel's 8th birthday party. He was wearing a paper crown, grinning at the camera with chocolate cake smeared across his face. I was beside him, laughing, my hand on his shoulder. Richard was in the background, checking his pager. This was 1993, before cell phones were ubiquitous, when pagers were the leash that kept important men tethered to their work even during family celebrations. I remember this day, I said softly. Daniel wanted a bouncy castle, but Richard said it was too expensive, too much of a spectacle for the neighbors. I paid for it with my household budget, told Daniel his father had arranged it. I always did that, gave Richard credit for things I did, trying to build him up in Daniel's eyes. Did it work? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. No. Daniel saw right through it, even as a kid. He knew where the love was coming from, and he resented me for it. Some children, they crave the love of the distant parent because it's rare, because it feels more valuable. They take the present parent for granted because that love is constant, dependable. Boring. Barbara nodded slowly. My mother was like you, she said, surprising me with this glimpse of something personal. My father traveled for work, came home with expensive gifts, played the hero. My mother did everything: homework, doctor's appointments, school projects, emotional support. And when I was a teenager, I treated her like garbage because she was always there, always available. It took me until my 30s to realize what I'd done, to appreciate what she'd sacrificed. Did you apologize? I asked, hungry for some hope that Daniel might someday, somehow, wake up and see me clearly. Yes. And she forgave me, because that's what mothers do. But some of that damage can't be undone. Some of those years we could have had a real relationship, I wasted them pushing her away. Barbara's expression hardened again, the momentary vulnerability locked back behind professional armor. Your son is 39 years old, Eleanor. If he hasn't figured it out by now, he probably never will. Some people are too committed to their narrative to change it. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. Because part of me, the part that still remembered baby Daniel, child Daniel, the boy who'd once crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, still hoped this lawsuit was somehow a misunderstanding, a mistake that could be corrected. That part of me kept expecting Daniel to call, to say he was sorry, to admit this had all gotten out of hand. He never called. Instead, 3 weeks after I hired Barbara, I received notice that Daniel's legal team wanted to depose me. The deposition was scheduled for 2 days before Thanksgiving, which felt deliberately cruel. Veronica was listed as one of the attorneys of record, which meant she'd be in the room, asking me questions, trying to trap me into saying something that would help their case. Depositions are theater, Barbara told me the day before. We were in her office again, doing practice runs, preparing me for every possible question. They're going to try to rattle you, make you angry, make you cry, make you say something emotional that they can use later. Your job is to stay calm, stay focused, and answer only what's asked. Don't volunteer information. Don't try to explain or justify. Just answer the specific question and stop talking. What if they ask about Richard's affairs? Then you answer truthfully. Yes, you were aware your husband had been unfaithful. No, you didn't know the full extent until after his death. Yes, it hurt you. Yes, you stayed in the marriage anyway, because that's what women of your generation often did. None of that helps their case. If anything, it reinforces that Richard owed you, that the will was his way of making amends. The deposition took place in a conference room in a downtown law office, one of those sterile spaces with too much fluorescent lighting and a table so polished I could see my reflection in it. There was a court reporter in the corner, fingers poised over her stenography machine. Daniel's legal team consisted of 3 people: Veronica, an older man named Howard Blackwell who apparently specialized in estate litigation, and a younger associate whose name I immediately forgot. Daniel wasn't there. I'd been prepared to see him, prepared for how that might feel. His absence was somehow worse. He couldn't even be bothered to show up while his lawyers tried to destroy me. Barbara sat beside me, calm and collected in another severe suit. She'd coached me on body language: sit up straight, keep your hands folded on the table, don't fidget, don't show emotion. Project dignity, she'd said. Project the image of a woman who has nothing to hide and nothing to apologize for. Veronica started with the easy questions. My full name, my date of birth, when I'd married Richard, where we'd lived. Her voice was professional, almost friendly, and I knew it was a trap. She was lulling me into a false sense of security before the real attack began. Mrs. Patterson, can you describe your role in your husband's business? I didn't have a role in his business. Richard kept his professional life separate from our home life. So you had no knowledge of his business dealings, his financial decisions? Only in the broadest sense. I knew he was successful in commercial real estate. I knew he owned various properties and investments, but the specifics were his domain. Veronica made a note on her legal pad. When did Richard first discuss his estate planning with you? This was where it got tricky. Richard didn't discuss his estate planning with me in detail. He told me he'd updated his will about 2 years before he died, and he assured me I would be taken care of. Did you ask him to leave everything to you? No. Did you suggest he should leave everything to you? No. Were you surprised when you learned the contents of his will? I paused, thinking carefully. Yes and no. I was surprised by the amount. I didn't know exactly how much wealth Richard had accumulated. But I wasn't surprised that he wanted to take care of me. We'd been married for 42 years. And in those 42 years, were you aware of your husband's extramarital affairs? There it was. The question I'd known was coming but still hit like a punch to the gut. I felt Barbara's hand briefly touch my arm under the table, a reminder to stay calm. I suspected, I said evenly. I wasn't aware of the full extent until after Richard's death. How did learning about these affairs make you feel? Objection, Barbara said immediately. Mrs. Patterson's emotional state is not relevant to this proceeding. Veronica smiled slightly. I'll rephrase. Did learning about these affairs change your understanding of why Richard might have structured his will the way he did? This was actually helpful to our case, so Barbara nodded slightly, giving me permission to answer. Yes, I said. I believe Richard felt guilty about how he treated me during our marriage. The will was his way of acknowledging that, of trying to make things right. So you believe you deserved this inheritance as compensation for being cheated on? The way she said it, dripping with disdain, made something hot flash through my chest. But I kept my voice level. I believe I deserve this inheritance for 42 years of partnership, for raising Richard's son, for managing his household, for supporting his career, and yes, for staying loyal to him even when he wasn't loyal to me. Veronica's eyes narrowed slightly. Let's talk about Daniel. Would you say you had a good relationship with your son growing up? Yes. When he was young, we were very close. When did that change? Gradually, starting in his early teens. Why do you think the relationship deteriorated? I could feel the trap closing around me. If I said I didn't know, I'd look like an oblivious mother who drove her son away without realizing it. If I blamed Daniel, I'd look bitter and vindictive. If I blamed Richard, I'd look like I was speaking ill of the dead. Adolescence is complicated, I said carefully. Daniel was trying to establish his own identity, and that often means pulling away from parents, especially mothers. I don't think it was personal, it was developmental. But the distance continued into adulthood. Daniel has maintained limited contact with you for over 15 years. That's more than just adolescent rebellion, wouldn't you say? I would say that Daniel made choices about the kind of relationship he wanted with me, and I've respected those choices, even though they've been painful. Have you ever considered that your behavior might have driven him away? Barbara's hand was on my arm again, tighter this time. Objection. That's argumentative and assumes facts not in evidence. But Veronica wasn't done. Mrs. Patterson, isn't it true that you were overbearing with Daniel as a child? That you suffocated him with attention because your marriage was unfulfilling? No, I said firmly. That is not true. I was present and involved, which is what parents are supposed to be. If Daniel found that suffocating, perhaps it's because he was being raised by one present parent and one absent parent, and he learned to value absence over presence. Veronica's jaw tightened. I'd scored a point, and she knew it. Let's talk about the will itself. When Richard told you he'd updated his will 2 years before his death, did you ask what changes he'd made? No. Why not? Because it felt morbid. Richard was in his late 60s, relatively healthy at the time. I didn't want to think about his death. Or you already knew what was in the will because you'd influenced him to make those changes. Objection, Barbara said sharply. Counsel is testifying rather than questioning. Veronica held up her hands in mock surrender. I'll move on. Mrs. Patterson, in the 2 years between when Richard updated his will and when he died, did you ever discuss his estate plans with him? Only once. About 6 months before he died, Richard told me he wanted me to be comfortable if anything happened to him. He said he'd made arrangements. That's all. Did he mention Daniel at all during that conversation? I hesitated, trying to remember exactly. He said he hoped Daniel would take care of himself, that he'd given Daniel the education and opportunities he needed to be successful on his own. Did you interpret that to mean Richard was leaving Daniel out of the will? I didn't know what it meant. I didn't ask for clarification because, again, I didn't want to think about Richard dying. The deposition went on for 4 more hours. They asked about every major purchase I'd made in the last 5 years, trying to prove I was extravagant, wasteful, the kind of woman who'd marry for money. They asked about my relationship with Richard's friends and business associates, trying to prove I'd isolated him. They asked about Richard's health, his medications, his state of mind in his final years. I answered every question the way Barbara had taught me, calmly, specifically, without elaboration. By the time they finished, I was exhausted, wrung out like a dish rag. But I'd held my ground. I hadn't cried, hadn't lost my temper, hadn't given them anything they could use to paint me as the villain in their story. When it was over, Barbara walked me to my car. You did well, she said. Better than well. You came across as credible, sympathetic, genuine. They didn't land any significant blows. When will we know what happens next? I asked. They'll review the deposition transcript, probably take a few more depositions of witnesses. Then we'll get a trial date, unless they decide to settle. Which, honestly, I think they should. Their case is weak, and you have the documentation to prove Richard's will was rational and justified. But some people would rather lose in court than admit they were wrong. I drove home in the dark, the city lights blurring past my windows. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and I had no plans for the holiday. No family to cook for, no traditions to uphold. Just me and the ghost of my marriage, rattling around in a house that had always been too big and too quiet. When I got home, there was a message on my answering machine. I still had a landline, another relic of my generation, something digital natives probably laughed at. I pressed play, expecting a Robocal or maybe Gregory Thornton with some update. It was Daniel's voice. I hadn't heard it in months, and the sound of it made my heart lurch painfully in my chest. "Mom," he said, and even that one word sounded cold, obligatory. "Veronica told me about the deposition today. I just wanted to say, I know this is hard. But it's not personal. It's about what's fair, what's right. Dad built that wealth over decades. He would have wanted me to have it, to continue his legacy. You have to understand that. This isn't about me not loving you. It's about honoring Dad's true wishes, even if he got confused at the end and didn't express them clearly in his will." There was a long pause, and I could hear someone talking in the background. Veronica, probably, coaching him on what to say. "Anyway," Daniel continued, "I hope you have a good Thanksgiving. Maybe next year, when this is all settled, we can have dinner together again. Like a real family." The message ended with a beep, mechanical and final. I stood in my kitchen, in the dark, and felt something inside me break in a new way. Because that message wasn't an olive branch. It was a threat disguised as sentiment. Daniel was telling me he still thought he'd win, that he believed his version of reality where Richard had been confused, where I was the problem, where everything would be fine once I was put back in my place. And that line about having dinner like a real family once this was settled. He meant once I'd given up, once I'd handed over the money, once I'd accepted my role as the supporting character in his story. If you've ever had someone you love tell you they'll love you again once you stop fighting for yourself, you know what I felt in that moment. And if you're still watching, still following this story, please hit that like button. Because what happens next is when I stopped being the victim and became something else entirely. Something my son never saw coming. Check the description box below for more stories like this, stories about people who refused to be erased. I spent Thanksgiving alone, which wasn't unusual. I'd spent many holidays alone or functionally alone, with Richard in his study working or Daniel making excuses about why he couldn't make it home. But this Thanksgiving felt different. This Thanksgiving, I wasn't alone because of other people's choices. I was alone because I'd chosen to fight, and fighting meant burning bridges I'd spent decades trying to maintain. I made a small turkey breast, there was no point in cooking a whole bird for one person, and ate it at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, watching the light fade over the backyard. Richard had insisted on this house in Chestnut Hill, with its manicured lawn and its 3-car garage and its 6 bedrooms we'd never needed. I'd wanted something smaller, cozier, a home instead of a showplace. But Richard's houses were like Richard's life, designed to impress people he didn't actually like. After dinner, I went back to Richard's study. I'd been spending a lot of time there since I found those files, reading through decades of documents, trying to understand the man I'd been married to. The more I learned, the more complicated the picture became. Richard hadn't just had affairs. He'd had entire relationships, some lasting years, with women he'd set up in apartments, women he'd supported financially. There were cancelled checks made out to names I didn't recognize, lease agreements he'd co-signed, credit card statements for cards I'd never seen. He'd essentially maintained parallel lives, the respectable public life with me, and these private lives with younger women who didn't ask for much beyond money and discretion. What surprised me wasn't the affairs themselves. I'd suspected for years, had seen the signs, the late nights, the unexplained absences, the way he'd pull away when I tried to be intimate with him. What surprised me was how organized it all was, how carefully he'd compartmentalized everything. Richard had run his infidelities the way he'd run his business, efficiently, methodically, with excellent record-keeping. I found myself wondering if Daniel knew. If Richard had ever told him man to man, father to son, passing down the legacy of how to maintain a respectable facade while living according to your own desires. Or if Daniel had figured it out on his own, had seen the signs just like I had, and had chosen his father's side because that's where the power was. There was a leather-bound journal in the bottom drawer of Richard's desk, hidden under a stack of old tax returns. I almost missed it. But something made me pull that drawer all the way out, made me reach into the back where the shadows were deepest, and there it was. Richard's handwriting filled the pages, dated entries going back 30 years. A diary, or something like it. I sat down with it, my hands shaking slightly, knowing I was about to read things I couldn't unread, learn things I couldn't unlearn. The early entries were about his business, about deals he was negotiating, properties he was acquiring. Boring stuff, mostly. But then, about 5 years into our marriage, the entries changed. November the 14th, 1989, Eleanor is pregnant. She's so happy about it, planning the nursery, reading books about child development. I should feel excited, but I just feel trapped. I married her because she was sweet and easy and wouldn't challenge me. Now I'm going to be tied to her forever. I see how my father's life narrowed after he had children, how everything became about obligation and responsibility. I don't want that. I want to build something that matters, something bigger than family dinners and little league games. I read that passage 3 times, each time feeling like I was being carved open with a dull knife. This was written when I was 5 months pregnant with Daniel, glowing with joy, believing that a baby would bring Richard and me closer together. And he'd felt trapped. He'd married me because I was easy, because I wouldn't challenge him. The entries continued, year after year, chronicling his affairs, his business triumphs, his growing frustration with the constraints of family life. March the 22nd, 1995. Daniel had a baseball game today. Eleanor was furious that I missed it for a meeting in New York. She doesn't understand that providing for my family means making sacrifices. I can't be everywhere at once. If I stop working for one moment, everything I've built could collapse. She wants me to be one of those involved fathers, coaching soccer and attending school plays. That's not who I am. That was never who I was. She married an ambitious man and now resents the ambition. June the 8th, 2001. Daniel graduates from high school next week. Eleanor wants me to make a speech at the graduation dinner, tell him how proud I am. But the truth is, I barely know him. He's Eleanor's son, really. She raised him, shaped him, filled his head with ideas I don't agree with. He's soft, sensitive, too concerned with other people's feelings. I'd hoped he'd be more like me, but Eleanor's influence was stronger. I look at him and see a stranger. The later entries were darker, full of regrets and justifications in equal measure. September the 3rd, 2019. I'm getting old. 70 years old next month, and I feel every year of it. My heart is failing. Foster says I need to be careful, reduce stress, all the usual medical warnings. I've been thinking about my legacy, what I'll leave behind. The business will continue without me. I've built it to be sustainable. But the personal legacy, the family legacy, that's more complicated. Daniel resents me, though he'd never admit it. He's built a life as far from mine as possible, married a woman as cold as I am, keeps his distance. I don't blame him. I wasn't a good father. I was too much like my own father, and I swore I'd never be like him. Eleanor deserves better than what I've given her. She deserved better from the beginning. She was 21 when we married, just a girl really, and I was 32, already hardened by ambition. I saw her sweetness and thought it meant weakness, thought it meant she'd be easy to manage. I was wrong. Her sweetness was strength. It took me 40 years to understand that. I'm changing my will. Everything goes to Eleanor. Daniel doesn't need my money, he's made his own success, and he has Veronica's income besides. But Eleanor will need it. She's given me 40 years of loyalty I never deserved, and the least I can do is make sure she's comfortable after I'm gone. Gregory tried to talk me out of it, said I should split things more evenly, but I won't. This is my decision, and it's the only decent decision I've made regarding my family in decades. I closed the journal and sat there in the darkness of Richard's study, crying for the first time since his funeral. Not because I'd loved him and lost him, but because I'd wasted 40 years loving a man who'd never really loved me back. Who'd seen my love as convenience, my loyalty as weakness, my devotion as something he could take for granted. But Richard had tried, at the end. He tried to make things right the only way he knew how, with money, with the will, with a gesture that cost him nothing in life but that he knew would mean something after death. And Daniel was trying to take that away from me. I took photographs of the journal entries with my phone, careful to capture every page clearly. Then I called Barbara Reeves, even though it was 9 o'clock on Thanksgiving night, even though I knew she probably wouldn't answer. She answered on the 3rd ring. Eleanor, what's wrong? I found something, I said, my voice still thick from crying. Richard's journal. He wrote about why he changed his will, about his relationship with Daniel, everything. It proves his decision was rational, deliberate, based on a clear understanding of his moral obligations. There was a pause. Have you read the whole thing? Most of it. The relevant parts. Send me the photos now. All of them. This could be exactly what we need. I spent the next hour photographing every page of that journal, sending them to Barbara in batches. My phone kept overheating from the camera use, and I had to stop periodically to let it cool down. When I finished, it was past midnight, technically no longer Thanksgiving. Barbara called me back at 12:30. "I've read through everything," she said, and her voice had that edge of excitement I'd learned to recognize. "Eleanor, this is remarkable. Richard essentially wrote a confession of his failures as a husband and father, along with a clear explanation of his testamentary intent. If we submit this as evidence, it will be nearly impossible for Daniel's team to argue that Richard was confused or unduly influenced. This shows premeditation, self-awareness, and a rationally considered decision. Will they try to claim it's fake? That I forged it somehow? They can try, but handwriting analysis will prove it's genuine. And the journal itself, the physical object, will show aging consistent with the dates of the entries. We'll have it authenticated by experts. This is going to change the trajectory of this case." I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. But all I felt was tired and sad. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we wait for a trial date and we prepare to present this evidence. I'll file a motion to include the journal in our exhibits. Daniel's team will fight it. They'll argue it's hearsay or that it violates Richard's privacy or any number of things. But a man's diary explaining his own testamentary decisions is powerful evidence of his state of mind and his intent. The judge will likely allow it." After I hung up, I went upstairs to bed, carrying Richard's journal with me. I set it on his side of the bed, the side that had been empty for months now, and lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the nights I'd slept beside a man I'd never really known. In the journal, Richard had written that my sweetness was strength. But sweetness alone hadn't been enough to save our marriage, to build a real partnership, to create the kind of family I dreamed of when I was 21 and naive and convinced that love could conquer anything. Strength, it turned out, meant something different. Strength meant standing up for yourself when everyone else wanted you to disappear quietly. Strength meant fighting, even when fighting meant losing the last shred of hope that your son might still love you. I fell asleep with the journal beside me like a talisman, like proof that I was real, that my life had mattered, that Richard had seen me clearly at least once before he died. The trial date was set for February 14th. Valentine's Day. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd be in court fighting my own son instead of celebrating love and romance. Not that I'd celebrated Valentine's Day in years. Richard had considered it a commercialized holiday, unnecessary when you'd been married as long as we had. The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas passed in a blur of preparation. Barbara had me come to her office multiple times a week, going over my testimony, preparing me for cross-examination, making sure I understood how to handle every possible attack Daniel's team might throw at me. "The journal is our ace," she said during one of these sessions. "But we can't rely on it alone. We need you to be a compelling witness, someone the judge will believe and sympathize with. That means being vulnerable without being weak, honest without being bitter, straightforward without being cold." "That's a lot of balancing acts," I said. "Welcome to litigation. It's all performance, Eleanor. Truth matters, but presentation matters more. We're not just proving Richard was competent when he made his will, we're proving you deserved what he left you, that you earned it through decades of loyalty and sacrifice." Christmas came and went. I sent Daniel a card. I couldn't help myself, couldn't quite break that maternal habit, but he didn't respond. I spent Christmas Eve alone in the house, watching old movies and drinking too much wine. I spent Christmas Day going through more of Richard's papers, finding more evidence of the life he'd lived separately from me. There were photographs hidden in his desk, pictures of Richard with various women at various times over the decades. He looked happy in those photos in a way I'd never seen him look happy with me. Relaxed, smiling, his arm around women who gazed up at him like he was remarkable. I studied those women's faces, trying to understand what they'd had that I hadn't. They were all younger, all conventionally attractive, but beyond that, they seemed to share a certain quality, a kind of lightness, an easiness, an ability to exist without needing anything from him beyond what he was willing to give in the moment. I'd always needed more. I'd needed commitment, partnership, emotional intimacy. I'd needed Richard to be present, to show up, to love me back with the same intensity I'd loved him. And he'd found that need exhausting, suffocating, demanding. The cruel irony was that if I'd been more like these other women, if I'd asked for less, expected less, needed less, maybe Richard would have loved me more. Or maybe he would have divorced me and married one of them, and I'd have been spared 40 years of partial love, conditional affection, relationship scraps. On January 15th, 1 month before the trial, Barbara called with news. Daniel's team wants to settle, she said without preamble. My heart jumped. Settle? What does that mean? It means they've reviewed our evidence, particularly the journal, and they've realized they can't win. So they want to negotiate. They're proposing a split. Daniel gets 40% of the estate, you keep 60%. That comes out to about $15 million for him, $22 million for you. $15 million. Daniel wanted $15 million of his father's money Richard had explicitly chosen not to leave him. No, I said immediately. Eleanor, I need you to think carefully about this. Yes, we can probably win if we go to trial. The journal is powerful evidence, and Daniel's case is weak. But trials are unpredictable. Judges are human, they make mistakes, they have biases, they have bad days. And even if we win, Daniel will probably appeal, which means more legal fees, more depositions, more years of your life consumed by this fight. A settlement means it ends now. You walk away with $22 million and the knowledge that you protected most of what Richard wanted you to have. And Daniel walks away thinking he was right, thinking he deserved that money, thinking I only kept the majority because I was stubborn. No. Richard didn't want Daniel to have his money. Richard wrote that explicitly in his journal. Accepting this settlement would be betraying Richard's clearly expressed wishes. Barbara sighed. I was afraid you'd say that. Okay. I'll tell them the offer is rejected. But Eleanor, you need to prepare yourself. This trial is going to be brutal. Daniel's team will attack you from every angle. Your marriage, your relationship with Daniel, your character. They'll imply you're greedy, manipulative, a gold digger who trapped Richard and poisoned his relationship with his son. And all of this will be public record. It will be in the newspapers, online, everywhere. Your dirty laundry and Richard's dirty laundry, aired for the entire city to see. I don't care, I said, and I was surprised to realize I meant it. Let them attack me. Let them say whatever they want. Richard left me that money because he knew what I'd endured, what I'd sacrificed. I won't give it up just to avoid embarrassment. All right. Then we go to trial. I'll start final preparations. The weeks before the trial felt like waiting for execution. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly, existed in a state of constant anxiety. I kept having nightmares where I was in the courtroom and couldn't speak, where words came out garbled and meaningless, where the judge looked at me with contempt and ruled in Daniel's favor. Barbara had me meet with a jury consultant, even though this was a bench trial, no jury, just a judge making the decision. We need to understand how you come across to people, the consultant explained. She was a woman in her 50s named Patricia Greenwood, with kind eyes and a clinical manner. What signals you're sending, what might be working against you. We did mock testimonies, filmed them, played them back. It was excruciating watching myself on screen. My posture, my expressions, the way my voice got thin and reedy when I was nervous. Patricia gave me exercises, taught me how to breathe, how to ground myself, how to project calm confidence even when I felt like I was falling apart. You're too apologetic, she said after one session. You say I'm sorry before answering questions, even when you have nothing to apologize for. You need to own your truth. You were a good wife. You were a good mother. You deserve what Richard left you. Say those things like you believe them. But that was the problem. I wasn't sure I did believe them. 40 years of being told I was too much, too needy, too emotional had left deep scars. I'd internalized Richard's view of me, Daniel's view of me. The woman who tried too hard, who loved too much, who couldn't take a hint that she wasn't wanted. What if they're right? I asked Patricia during one of our last sessions. What if I was a suffocating mother? What if I did drive Daniel away with my neediness? Patricia leaned forward, her expression serious. Eleanor, I've worked with hundreds of clients, and I've learned something about family dynamics. Children who grow up with one present parent and one absent parent almost always idealize the absent one. It's a survival mechanism. They can't admit that the parent who's supposed to love them doesn't know how, so they blame the parent who's there. You were convenient to blame. You were safe to blame. Daniel knew you'd never abandon him, so he could treat you terribly and you'd still be there. His father might have walked away completely if Daniel had been difficult, so Daniel learned to be easy with him, to ask for nothing, to accept scraps. Then why does he hate me so much? He doesn't hate you. He hates that he needs you, or that he needed you once. He hates that you represent all the emotional vulnerability he's spent his life trying to avoid. Destroying you in court isn't about money, Eleanor. It's about destroying the part of himself he's ashamed of, the part that wanted his mother's love and felt pathetic for wanting it. That thought stayed with me as the trial date approached. Daniel wasn't fighting for money. He was fighting to prove that I didn't matter, that I'd never mattered, that his father's decision to leave me everything was a mistake that needed correcting. But I mattered to Richard, at least at the end. And I was going to make damn sure the court knew it. February 14th arrived cold and grey, the kind of Philadelphia winter day where the sky presses down like wet cement and you can't remember what sunshine feels like. I'd barely slept the night before, had spent hours trying on different outfits before settling on a simple black dress and pearls. Widow's clothes, Barbara had called them approvingly. Clothes that signaled mourning, respectability, worthiness. The courthouse was downtown, one of those imposing buildings with marble columns and too many stairs. Barbara met me outside at 8:30, even though the trial wasn't scheduled to start until 10. "I want to go over a few last-minute things," she said, steering me toward a coffee shop across the street. "And I want to give you a heads up about something." We sat in a corner booth, away from the morning rush of lawyers and clerks grabbing coffee before court. Barbara ordered us both black coffee, no time for elaborate drinks, and then looked at me seriously. "Daniel will be there today," she said. "And Veronica. They'll be sitting at the plaintiff's table, and you're going to have to look at them, potentially for hours. I need to know you can handle that." Could I handle looking at my son while his lawyers tried to destroy me? I honestly didn't know. "I'll manage," I said, because what else could I say? The judge is Arthur Brennan. He's been on the bench for 15 years, generally fair, not particularly sympathetic to either side in these cases. He'll let us present our evidence, he'll listen to both sides, and he'll make a decision based on the law. That's good for us. Emotional appeals won't work, but solid evidence will. And we have solid evidence. We went over my testimony one more time, Barbara asking me the questions she'd ask on direct examination, making sure my answers were clear, confident, free of the apologetic tone Patricia had warned me about. By 9:30, we were ready. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, less dramatic. Wood paneling, harsh fluorescent lighting, rows of benches for spectators, mostly empty, thank God. This wasn't a sensational case, wasn't the kind of thing that drew media attention. Just a family eating itself alive over money, nothing the world hadn't seen 1,000 times before. Daniel and Veronica were already there, sitting at a table on the left side of the courtroom. Howard Blackwell, their lead attorney, was arranging papers, whispering with them. I forced myself to look at Daniel, to really look at him. He'd aged in the months since his father's funeral. There were lines around his eyes I didn't remember, grey threading through his dark hair. He wore an expensive suit, Richard's tailor, probably, and he sat with Richard's posture, that straight-backed confidence of men who'd never doubted their right to take up space. When our eyes met, something flickered across his face. Not regret, not affection. Just a kind of weary resignation, like I was a problem he was tired of dealing with. Veronica, sitting beside him, looked like she'd dressed for battle. Severe grey suit, hair pulled back so tightly it must have hurt, her expression carved from ice. When she saw me looking, she leaned over and whispered something to Daniel. He nodded without looking at me again. Barbara and I took our seats at the defense table. Though in this case, I was technically the defendant, the one being accused of undue influence, of manipulating my way into an inheritance I didn't deserve. The court reporter was already there, setting up her equipment. A clerk moved around the room, preparing documents. At exactly 10 o'clock, the bailiff entered. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Arthur Brennan." We stood. The judge entered through a door behind the bench, a man in his 60s, black, with silver hair and an expression that gave nothing away. He settled into his chair, reviewed something on his computer, then looked up at us. "Please be seated. We're here today for the matter of Patterson versus Patterson, a will contest. Counsel, are both sides ready to proceed?" Howard Blackwell stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff is ready." Barbara stood. "The defendant is ready, Your Honor." Judge Brennan nodded. "Mr. Blackwell, you may present your opening statement." And so it began. Howard Blackwell was good, I had to admit. He painted a picture of Richard as a brilliant but deteriorating man, medications affecting his judgment, my constant presence warping his decision-making. He described me as a tragic figure who'd been married to a man who hadn't loved her, who'd become desperate as she aged, who'd seen Richard's declining health as an opportunity. The evidence will show, Blackwell said, pacing in front of the judge, that Eleanor Patterson exerted constant, subtle pressure on her husband in his final years. She isolated him from his son, filled his head with grievances about her allegedly thankless life, and ultimately convinced him to cut his only child out of his will entirely. This was not Richard Patterson's true wish, it was Eleanor Patterson's manipulation, pure and simple. I wanted to stand up, to scream that it was all lies, that Richard had made his own choices, that I'd never asked for anything. But Barbara's hand was on my arm, holding me still, keeping me silent. When it was Barbara's turn, she stood slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle before she spoke. Your Honor, the evidence will indeed show manipulation in this case, but not the kind Mr. Blackwell described. The manipulation here was Daniel Patterson's manipulation of his father's memory to suit his own financial interests. Richard Patterson was a meticulous, intelligent man who made a deliberate choice to leave his estate to his wife of 42 years. He made this choice after careful consideration, with full legal capacity, and he documented his reasoning extensively. The evidence will show that Richard Patterson knew exactly what he was doing when he structured his will the way he did, and that his decision was based on a lifetime of observation about who had earned his assets and who had not. Judge Brennan made a note on his legal pad. Mr. Blackwell, call your first witness. The next 3 hours were a nightmare. Blackwell called Richard's doctor first, Dr. Raymond Foster, who'd treated Richard for the last decade of his life. Under Blackwell's questioning, Foster described Richard's various health conditions, his medications, the potential side effects of those medications. Could these medications have affected Mr. Patterson's judgment or cognitive function? Blackwell asked. Foster hesitated. In some patients, yes. But I never observed any cognitive decline in Richard. He was sharp, engaged, perfectly capable of making his own medical decisions and handling his affairs. But you can't rule out the possibility of subtle cognitive effects. I suppose not. No physician can guarantee that medications have zero effect on a patient's mental state. Barbara's cross-examination focused on Richard's actual cognitive state, not theoretical possibilities. Dr. Foster, in all your years treating Richard Patterson, did you ever observe any signs of dementia, confusion, or inability to understand complex information? No. Did you ever have concerns about his mental capacity? No. Would you have cleared him to sign legal documents requiring full mental capacity? Yes. Without hesitation. Next came several of Richard's business associates, called by Blackwell to testify about Richard's state of mind in his final years. They all said essentially the same thing. Richard seemed tired, maybe a bit withdrawn, but professionally he remained sharp and capable. None of them could speak to his personal life, his marriage, his reasons for structuring his will the way he did. Then Blackwell called Daniel. My son walked to the witness stand like he was walking to a business meeting, confident, composed, like this was just another transaction to be handled efficiently. He didn't look at me when he was sworn in. Mr. Patterson, Blackwell began, can you describe your relationship with your father? It was complex, Daniel said carefully. My father was not an emotionally expressive man. He showed his love through providing for me, ensuring I had every opportunity. We didn't have long heart-to-heart conversations, but I never doubted that he cared about my success, my future. And your relationship with your mother? Something tightened in Daniel's jaw. Also complex. My mother she's an intense person. Growing up, I often felt smothered by her attention. She wanted to be involved in every aspect of my life in a way that felt excessive. As an adult, I've maintained distance because I find that healthier for both of us. Each word was a knife, precise and deliberate. Barbara had warned me this would happen, but hearing my son describe me as intense and excessive, hearing him characterize my love as something he needed distance from, it took everything I had not to react. When did you learn about the contents of your father's will? Blackwell asked. A few days after his funeral. His attorney, Gregory Thornton, informed me that my father had left everything to my mother. I was shocked. My father had always talked about legacy, about building something that would last beyond his lifetime. I'd assumed I would inherit at least a portion of his estate so I could continue that legacy. Did you ever discuss inheritance with your father directly? Not in specific terms. But he'd made comments over the years about wanting the Patterson name to mean something, about the business and the wealth he'd built being passed down through generations. Leaving everything to my mother didn't align with those stated values. What was your mother's relationship with your father like in his final years? Daniel paused, as if choosing his words carefully. From what I observed, my mother became more demanding as my father aged. She seemed to resent his work, his commitments outside their marriage. I witnessed several arguments where she accused him of neglecting her, of prioritizing his business over their relationship. It seemed to me that she was using his declining health as leverage to extract promises, to secure her future at the expense of his clearly stated wishes about legacy. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles went white. Barbara's hand covered mine, a warning to stay composed. Barbara's cross-examination was surgical. Mr. Patterson, you testified that you never discussed inheritance specifics with your father. So you don't actually know what his wishes were regarding his estate, do you? Not in explicit terms, but... Yes or no, please. Did your father ever tell you directly that he wanted you to inherit his business or his wealth? Daniel's jaw clenched. No, not directly. How often did you visit your father in the last 5 years of his life? I don't know exactly. Several times a year. Several times a year. And how far away do you live from your parents' home? About 20 minutes. 20 minutes away, but you visited only several times a year. How often did you call your father? When I had time. Maybe once a month. Once a month. And yet you claim to have deep insight into your father's wishes, his values, his intentions for his estate. Is that accurate? I knew my father. Time spent doesn't equate to understanding. Let's talk about that understanding. You testified that your mother was demanding in your father's final years. How do you know this? Were you present for these alleged arguments? I heard about them. From whom? From my father. He'd mention them occasionally. Occasionally. During those monthly phone calls where you caught up on his life. Daniel's face flushed slightly. My father and I had a private relationship. We didn't need constant contact to understand each other. I see. And this private relationship, did it include your father confiding in you about his will, his estate planning, his feelings about your mother? Not in those exact words. Not in any words, correct? Your father never told you he wanted to leave you his estate. He never told you he felt manipulated by your mother. He never told you his will didn't reflect his true wishes. All of that is your interpretation, your assumption, based on limited contact and occasional phone calls. Is that accurate? Daniel's lawyer stood. Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative. Overruled. The witness may answer. Daniel stared at Barbara with barely concealed hostility. My father didn't need to tell me everything explicitly. I understood him. But apparently not as well as you thought, since he left everything to your mother, not to you. Objection. Blackwell was on his feet. Your Honor, counsel is badgering the witness. Sustained. Ms. Reeves, move on. Barbara nodded, but she'd made her point. When Daniel stepped down from the witness stand, he looked rattled, angry. Veronica leaned over and whispered something to him, probably trying to calm him down. The rest of the afternoon was spent on financial experts, people brought in to testify about the estate's value, about Richard's business acumen, about whether someone in his condition could have made sound financial decisions. It was boring, technical testimony that probably mattered legally but felt divorced from the emotional reality of what was happening. By 4 o'clock, Judge Brennan called a recess until the next morning. We'll reconvene at 9 a.m. tomorrow, he said. I expect we'll finish plaintiff's case and begin defendant's case by end of day tomorrow. Barbara and I left through a side door to avoid Daniel and his team. We went back to her office, and she ordered Chinese food while we debriefed. Today went well, she said, attacking her Kung Pao chicken with chopsticks. Daniel's testimony was helpful to us, actually. He came across as distant, presumptuous, someone making assumptions about his father's wishes without any real evidence. The judge noticed, I saw him making notes during your cross-examination. He looked so angry, I said quietly. I hadn't touched my food, couldn't imagine eating. When you questioned him about how often he visited Richard, how little they actually communicated, He looked like he wanted to hurt someone. Good. Angry witnesses make mistakes. If he's called to testify again, he might lose his temper, say something damaging to his case. We'll see. I went home that night exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. I was emotionally depleted, scraped hollow by the experience of sitting in that courtroom while my son testified that I was demanding, excessive, manipulative. While he painted himself as the wronged party, the son who understood his father's true wishes despite never actually talking to him about them. I thought about calling someone, but who? I had no close friends, no family besides Daniel. Richard's death had revealed how isolated I'd become, how my entire social circle had been contingent on being Mrs. Richard Patterson, on playing my role in Richard's life. Instead, I poured myself a large glass of wine and sat in Richard's study, looking at his journal, which would be presenting tomorrow as evidence. This journal, these private thoughts, would be read in court, made part of the public record. Richard's infidelities, his regrets, his confession that he'd failed as a husband and father, all of it would be exposed. Part of me felt guilty about that. Richard was dead, he couldn't defend himself, couldn't explain or contextualize his words. But another part of me, the part that had hardened over these months of fighting, felt no guilt at all. Richard had made choices. He'd lived his life according to his own desires, regardless of how it affected me or Daniel. And he'd tried to make amends in the only way he knew how, through his will. If exposing his secrets was what it took to honor his final wishes, so be it. Stay with me, because tomorrow is when the real battle begins. Tomorrow is when the judge learns the truth about my marriage, about Richard's guilt, about why that will was written exactly the way it was. And if you think you know where this story is going, trust me, you don't. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. The second day of trial began with more of Blackwell's witnesses, a neighbor who testified that Richard had seemed confused in his final months, though under Barbara's cross-examination she admitted she'd only spoken to him twice in that entire time period. A former business partner who said Richard had made some uncharacteristic decisions toward the end, though he couldn't actually specify what those decisions were or why they were problematic. It was clear Blackwell's case was weak, relying on innuendo and speculation rather than concrete evidence. By lunch, Judge Brennan looked impatient. "Mr. Blackwell," he said as we prepared to break for lunch, "how many more witnesses do you have?" "3, Your Honor." "Can you complete your case today?" "Yes, Your Honor." "See that you do. I want to move to defendant's case this afternoon." After lunch, Blackwell called his final witnesses, 2 of Richard's colleagues from the early days of his business, both retired, both barely remembering specifics about Richard's personality or mental state in his final years. Their testimony was rambling, unfocused, and Judge Brennan cut them off twice to ask them to stick to relevant information. By 3 o'clock, Blackwell rested his case. "Ms. Reeves," Judge Brennan said, "you may call your first witness." Barbara stood. "Your Honor, the defense calls Mrs. Eleanor Patterson." This was it. The moment I'd been preparing for, dreading, knowing was inevitable. I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt wooden, unsteady. The bailiff swore me in. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth?" And I said I did, my voice sounding small in the formal courtroom space. I sat down, smoothed my dress, and looked at Barbara. Not at Daniel, not at Veronica, not at Judge Brennan. Just at Barbara, who told me to find one friendly face and focus on it. "Mrs. Patterson," Barbara began, her voice gentle but clear, "can you tell us how you met Richard Patterson?" And so I told my story. The story I'd been living with for over 40 years but had never really told anyone, not completely, not honestly. I told them about being 21 years old, working as a secretary at Richard's real estate company, how he'd noticed me and asked me to dinner. How flattered I'd been that this successful, sophisticated man was interested in me. How my mother had been thrilled, had told me I'd be crazy to let him go, that men like Richard didn't come along often for girls like me. "Girls like you?" Barbara asked. "What did your mother mean by that?" "I came from a working-class family. My father was a factory worker. We didn't have money, didn't have connections. My mother saw Richard as my ticket to a better life, and she wasn't wrong. Marrying Richard gave me security, status, a life I never could have built on my own." "Did you love him when you married him?" I paused, thinking about how to answer honestly. I thought I did. I was very young, and I confused being chosen by him with love. I thought if someone like Richard wanted me, I must be special. I thought I could make him love me if I tried hard enough. And did that work? No. The word came out flat, final. Richard was a good provider. He gave me a beautiful home, financial security, social status. But he never really loved me, not the way I loved him. I think he married me because I was convenient, because I wouldn't challenge him or make demands that interfered with his ambitions. Across the courtroom, I could feel Daniel shifting in his seat. But I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on Barbara. Can you describe your marriage? Lonely, I said simply. Richard worked constantly. When he was home, he was distant, preoccupied. We lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, but we were rarely truly together. I learned early on that his business would always come first, that my role was to manage the household, host dinners for his associates, and not expect much emotional connection. Did you know about Richard's affairs? The question hung in the air. I took a breath. I suspected for years. The late nights, the business trips that seemed excessive, the way he'd pull away when I tried to be intimate. I didn't have proof until after he died and I went through his papers. Then I found documentation of multiple affairs spanning decades. How did that make you feel? Devastated. Even though I'd suspected, having it confirmed, seeing the evidence of all these other women, these other relationships he'd maintained while I was home alone, it destroyed something in me. But it also helped me understand why Richard structured his will the way he did. He felt guilty. He knew he'd failed me as a husband, and the will was his way of trying to make things right. Barbara walked over to her table and picked up Richard's journal. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Defendant's Exhibit A, Richard Patterson's personal journal. Blackwell was on his feet immediately. Objection. Your Honor. This journal is hearsay, it's prejudicial, and its authenticity hasn't been properly established. Your Honor, Barbara said calmly, we have a handwriting expert prepared to testify that this is indeed Richard Patterson's handwriting. The journal itself shows aging consistent with its purported dates. And as for hearsay, this journal is being offered to prove Richard Patterson's state of mind and his testamentary intent. It falls squarely within the state of mind exception to the hearsay rule. Judge Brennan considered this. I'll allow it subject to authentication. Ms. Reeves, make sure you have that handwriting expert ready to testify. Yes, Your Honor. Barbara opened the journal to a marked page and handed it to me. Mrs. Patterson, can you read this entry dated March 15, 2023? My hands trembled slightly as I took the journal. I found the entry. I'd read it so many times I practically had it memorized. I began to read aloud, my voice steady despite the emotions churning in my chest. I'm 70 years old, and I'm finally understanding things I should have understood decades ago. Eleanor has been loyal to me for 40 years, even though I've given her so little in return. She raised our son essentially alone while I built my business. She tolerated my affairs, and yes, she knew, even though we never spoke of them directly. She managed our household, represented our family in social situations, and asked for almost nothing except that I show up occasionally, be present occasionally. And I couldn't even do that. I was too busy, too ambitious, too focused on building something that would outlast me. I paused, swallowing hard. Across the room, Daniel was completely still, his face pale. I continued reading. Daniel blames Eleanor for everything wrong in our relationship, but that's my fault. I taught him to value absence over presence, to respect distance over intimacy. I modeled a kind of masculinity that equates emotional unavailability with strength. And Eleanor paid the price for that, became the scapegoat for my failures as a father. My voice caught, but I pushed through. I'm changing my will. Everything goes to Eleanor. Daniel doesn't need my money, he's successful on his own, and he has Veronica's income besides. But Eleanor will need it. She's given me 40 years of loyalty I never deserved, and the least I can do is make sure she's comfortable after I'm gone. This is my decision, freely made, with full understanding of what I'm doing. I'm not confused, not being manipulated. I'm simply trying to correct a lifetime of taking her for granted. The courtroom was absolutely silent when I finished. I looked up from the journal and for the first time since testifying began, I let myself look at Daniel. He was staring at me, or through me, his face completely drained of color. His hands were clenched into fists on the table in front of him. Veronica was whispering something to him urgently, but he didn't seem to hear her. Mrs. Patterson, Barbara said gently, What did you think when you found this journal entry? I thought. I had to stop, collect myself. I thought that Richard finally saw me, finally understood what our marriage had actually been. And I thought that his will, leaving everything to me, it wasn't about punishing Daniel. It was about acknowledging me, recognizing that I'd earned something for all those years of loyalty. Barbara let that statement hang in the air for a moment. Then, did you ever ask Richard to change his will? Never. Did you ever suggest he should leave everything to you? Never. Did you manipulate him, pressure him, or exert any undue influence over his testamentary decisions? No. I didn't even know what was in his will until after he died. This was entirely Richard's choice. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Brennan looked at Blackwell. Cross-examination. Blackwell stood slowly. He looked like a man who knew his case had just fallen apart but had to go through the motions anyway. Mrs. Patterson, you claim you didn't know about your husband's affairs until after his death. But you just testified that you suspected for years. Which is it? I suspected but didn't have proof. There's a difference between suspicion and knowledge. Convenient that you found this proof only after your husband died and couldn't defend himself against your accusations. I found documentation in his files. I can provide copies of bank statements, credit card bills, lease agreements, all in Richard's handwriting or with his signature. The affairs are facts, not accusations. Blackwell changed tactics. This journal. How do we know you didn't write it yourself? How do we know it's not a fabrication designed to support your case? We have a handwriting expert who will testify to its authenticity, I said calmly. And if you doubt that, you're welcome to hire your own expert to examine it. He tried a few more questions, attempting to paint me as bitter, vindictive, a woman who'd waited until Richard was dead to destroy his reputation. But every question gave me the opportunity to talk about the reality of my marriage, about Richard's documented choices, about the journal entries written in his own hand. Finally, Blackwell gave up. No further questions. I stepped down from the witness stand, my legs shaking, and returned to my seat beside Barbara. She gave me a brief, approving nod. The rest of the afternoon was spent on technical testimony, the handwriting expert who confirmed the journal was indeed Richard's, Gregory Thornton testifying again about Richard's clear mental capacity when updating his will, Dr. Foster returning to emphasize that Richard showed no signs of cognitive decline. By 5 o'clock, both sides had rested their cases. Judge Brennan looked at his calendar. Closing arguments will be tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I'll take the matter under advisement and issue my ruling within 30 days. We're adjourned. The gavel came down, sharp and final. Barbara and I gathered our things quickly, trying to leave before Daniel and his team. But as we reached the courtroom doors, I heard Daniel's voice behind me. Mom. I stopped. Turned. Daniel was standing a few feet away, Veronica and Blackwell behind him looking uncomfortable. We need to talk, Daniel said. His voice was tight, strained. About what? I asked. Your lawyers will get the judge's ruling in a few weeks. There's nothing left to talk about. About that journal. About Dad's, about what he wrote. You mean about the truth? About the fact that your father knew he'd failed us both, and he tried to make amends the only way he knew how. Daniel flinched. He was old. He was sick. People get sentimental when they're dying, they rewrite history to make themselves feel better about their choices. Or maybe, I said quietly, they finally see things clearly. Maybe all the ambition and the status and the success falls away, and they're left with the truth of what really mattered. And what really mattered, Daniel, was loyalty. Presence. Showing up. Things your father failed at and things I did well, whether you want to acknowledge that or not. You turned him against me. I didn't have to. You turned yourself away from both of us years ago. You chose to see your father as some kind of hero and me as a villain because that narrative was easier than admitting your father was flawed and I was human. But the truth is in that journal, in your father's own words. He knew what he was doing when he wrote that will. Daniel's jaw worked, emotions flickering across his face too quickly to name. Finally, he said, if the judge rules in your favor, I'll appeal. I'll keep fighting this. Then you'll lose more money in legal fees fighting for money you were never supposed to have. Your choice. I walked out of the courthouse with Barbara, leaving my son standing in that hallway, and I didn't look back. The month waiting for Judge Brennan's ruling was the longest month of my life. Longer than the 9 months I carried Daniel. Longer than any of the lonely years with Richard. Because this month held my entire future in its hands, financial security or ruin, validation or shame, justice or continued abuse. I tried to go about normal life, but there was no normal anymore. I went to the grocery store and imagined losing the house, pictured myself in a small apartment somewhere, starting over at 63 with nothing. I walked through the rooms Richard had filled with expensive furniture and art, wondering which pieces I'd have to sell if the ruling went against me. Barbara called once a week with updates that weren't really updates. No news yet, the judge was working on it, these things took time. I could hear in her voice that she was confident, that she believed we'd won. But confidence wasn't certainty, and I'd learned too much about how life could betray you to feel anything but dread. 3 weeks into the wait, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I'd learned to be suspicious of unknown calls, assuming they were reporters or distant relatives who'd somehow heard about the case and wanted to offer opinions I hadn't asked for. But something made me pick up. Mrs. Patterson. A woman's voice, young, uncertain. Yes. My name is Melissa Garner. This is awkward, but I think we need to talk. It's about Richard Patterson. My stomach dropped. Who are you? I was involved with your husband. For about 5 years, until about 3 years ago. I saw the news about the trial, about his will, and I have information I think you should know. We met at a coffee shop in Center City, neutral territory, somewhere public. Melissa Garner was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with auburn hair and tired eyes. She looked nervous, clutching her coffee cup like a life preserver. I don't know where to start, she said when we sat down. Start with how you knew my husband. She took a deep breath. I was a paralegal at a firm Richard used for some of his business deals. We met at a meeting about a property acquisition. He was charming, attentive, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. I was 29, recently divorced, kind of lost. And he was this successful, sophisticated older man who seemed genuinely interested in me. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. This story was familiar. I'd read versions of it in Richard's files, in the letters from other women. We started an affair, Melissa continued. He rented an apartment for me in Rittenhouse Square, helped me with my student loans, took care of me financially. I knew he was married. He was always honest about that. He said you and he had an understanding, that the marriage was basically over emotionally but you stayed together for practical reasons. That wasn't true, I said quietly. I know that now. But at the time, I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Melissa wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The affair lasted 5 years. And then, 3 years ago, Richard ended it. Just like that. He said he was getting older, needed to simplify his life, couldn't keep maintaining these separate worlds. He was generous about it, paid off my student loans completely, gave me enough money to buy a condo outright. But he ended it. Why are you telling me this? Because of what he said when he ended it. He said. She paused, her eyes welling up. He said he'd been a terrible husband to you, and a terrible father to his son, and he was running out of time to make things right. He said he'd spent his whole life taking the easy path, building businesses instead of relationships, having affairs instead of fixing his marriage, buying people off instead of actually connecting with them. He said he was tired of being that person. I stared at her, this woman who'd been with my husband, who'd shared parts of him I'd never accessed. He said that. Yes. And more. He talked about you, about how loyal you'd been, how patient, how you'd raised Daniel essentially alone while Richard was off building his empire. He said he'd taken you for granted because you were always there, and he'd finally realized that constancy, that loyalty, was worth more than all the exciting affairs and business deals that had seemed so important. Tears were running down my face before I realized I was crying. Not because Richard had finally seen me, I'd known that from the journal. But hearing it from someone else, from one of the women he'd chosen over me for so many years, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Why did you want to meet? I managed to ask. Because I read about the trial, about your son trying to contest the will. And I thought you should know that Richard was clear-headed and purposeful when he made those decisions. He wasn't confused or manipulated. He was finally being honest with himself about what mattered. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. And because I have this, Richard wrote it after we broke up and sent it to me about a year before he died. I don't know why. Maybe he needed someone to know his thoughts, and he couldn't say them to you directly. Maybe he was testing out his feelings before making them permanent in his will. But after reading about the trial, I thought you should have it. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter in Richard's handwriting, addressed to Melissa but really written to himself. Dear Melissa, I've been thinking about legacy lately, what I'll leave behind when I die. The business will continue without me. The buildings will still stand. The investments will still generate returns. But what about the human legacy? What will people say about Richard Patterson the man, not Richard Patterson the businessman? The truth is probably that I'll be remembered as successful but cold. As someone who achieved a lot professionally but failed personally. And that's a fair assessment. I've spent 68 years prioritizing the wrong things. I chose work over family, excitement over stability, new conquests over deepening the relationships I already had. I hurt people who loved me, you, Eleanor, probably others I'm not even aware of. And for what? For money? For status? For the fleeting satisfaction of building something impressive? Eleanor deserved better than me. She deserved a partner who showed up, who was present, who valued her for more than her ability to manage a household and play the role of dutiful wife. She gave me 40 years of loyalty, and I gave her mostly absence and indifference. Daniel deserved better too. He deserved a father who went to his games, who listened to his problems, who modeled how to be emotionally available and present. Instead, I modeled how to be successful and distant, how to equate love with provision rather than presence. I can't undo any of it. I can't go back and be a better husband or father. But I can make sure Eleanor is taken care of, that she has the financial security to live comfortably without me. It's not enough, it will never be enough, but it's what I can do now. I hope you found happiness, Melissa. I hope you found someone who can give you what I couldn't, real commitment, real presence, real love instead of the convenient facsimile I offered. I'm sorry for the ways I hurt you too. Richard. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words. When I finally looked up, Melissa was crying too. Thank you, I whispered. Thank you for bringing this to me. I'm sorry, she said. I'm sorry for being part of what hurt you. You were young. He was the one who was married, who had responsibilities. He was the one who made those choices. We sat there for a while longer, 2 women connected by one complicated man, both of us trying to understand how to move forward from the damage he'd left behind. When I got home, I called Barbara immediately and told her about the letter. This is good, she said. Very good. It's additional evidence of Richard's state of mind, of his clear understanding of his obligations and his reasons for structuring the will the way he did. I'll file it as supplemental evidence. Do you think we'll win? There was a pause. Eleanor, based on the evidence, based on the testimony, based on how weak Daniel's case was, yes. I think we'll win. But I've been practicing law long enough to know that nothing is certain until the judge issues a ruling. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning in mid-March, Barbara called at 8 a.m. The ruling is in, she said. Judge Brennan's clerk just called. He's issuing his decision today at 2 p.m. We need to be in court. I don't remember getting dressed, don't remember the drive downtown. I was operating on autopilot, my mind white noise and terror. This was it. After months of fighting, months of depositions and testimony and evidence, this was the moment that would determine whether I'd honored Richard's wishes or failed him one final time. Barbara met me outside the courtroom at 1:30. Whatever happens, she said, you fought hard. You told your truth. You didn't let Daniel steamroll you into giving up something that was rightfully yours. We entered the courtroom. Daniel and his team were already there, Daniel's face unreadable, Veronica looking confident in a way that made my stomach churn. What did she know that I didn't? At exactly 2 p.m., Judge Brennan entered and we all stood. He settled into his seat, arranged his papers, and looked out at us with those inscrutable eyes. I've reviewed all the evidence in this matter, he began, and I've given considerable thought to the arguments presented by both sides. This is a case about testamentary intent. What did Richard Patterson want when he structured his will, and was he capable of making that decision freely and with full capacity? My heart was hammering so hard I could barely hear him. The plaintiff, Daniel Patterson, argues that his father was either mentally incompetent when he made the will or was subject to undue influence by his wife. The evidence, however, does not support either claim. Barbara's hand found mine under the table, squeezed. Richard Patterson was examined by multiple medical professionals in his final years. None of them noted any cognitive decline, dementia, or mental incapacity. He continued to make complex business decisions up until his death. The medications he took, while potentially having side effects, were not shown to have actually impaired his judgment or decision-making ability. Judge Brennan flipped a page. As for undue influence, the court finds no evidence that Eleanor Patterson manipulated or pressured her husband regarding his estate planning. On the contrary, the evidence shows that Mrs. Patterson was not even aware of the specific contents of the will until after her husband's death. The journal entries written by Richard Patterson, authenticated by handwriting experts, make clear that his decision to leave his estate to his wife was made freely, with full understanding of what he was doing, and for reasons he explicitly articulated. I couldn't breathe. Was he saying? Richard Patterson wrote extensively about his regrets regarding his marriage and his relationship with his son. He acknowledged his failures as a husband and father. He expressed clear intent to provide for his wife as a way of acknowledging her decades of loyalty and his own shortcomings. This is not the reasoning of a confused or manipulated man. This is the reasoning of someone who has engaged in serious self-reflection and made a deliberate choice about how to distribute his assets. Judge Brennan looked directly at Daniel. The plaintiff's claims that his father would have wanted him to inherit the business and continue his legacy are not supported by any concrete evidence. They are based on the plaintiff's assumptions and interpretations, not on any statements Richard Patterson actually made. In fact, the journal entries suggest Richard Patterson believed his son was financially successful on his own and did not require an inheritance. Then Judge Brennan looked at me. The court finds that Richard Patterson's will accurately reflects his testamentary intent, was made with full mental capacity, and was not the result of undue influence. Therefore, the plaintiff's challenge to the will is denied. The will shall be admitted to probate as written, and Eleanor Patterson shall inherit the estate as Richard Patterson intended. The gavel came down. I'd won. But I barely had time to process it before Judge Brennan continued speaking, and what he said next made the entire courtroom freeze. However, before we adjourn, there's a matter the court must address. He pulled out another document, and his expression darkened. In the course of reviewing evidence for this case, certain financial irregularities came to light. Specifically, there appear to be several suspicious transfers from Richard Patterson's accounts in the months before his death, transfers that were not disclosed in the estate inventory. My blood went cold. What was he talking about? Judge Brennan looked at Daniel. Mr. Patterson, these transfers total approximately $4 million, and they were made to accounts in your name. Can you explain these transactions? The courtroom erupted. Blackwell was on his feet, Veronica was whispering frantically to Daniel, Barbara was gripping my arm, and Daniel. Daniel had gone absolutely white, his eyes wide with what looked like genuine shock. Your Honor, Blackwell stammered, we weren't aware of these transfers. This is the first we're hearing about them. That's because they were deliberately concealed, Judge Brennan said coldly. Hidden in offshore accounts, routed through shell companies. The kind of concealment that suggests someone knew these transfers wouldn't withstand scrutiny. He pulled out another document. What's more troubling is that these transfers occurred within 6 months of Richard Patterson's death, and they bear electronic signatures that forensic analysis suggests may have been forged. The word forged hung in the air like a bomb. Judge Brennan looked at Daniel again. Mr. Patterson, did you have access to your father's accounts before his death? Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I had power of attorney. For medical decisions. But I didn't. The power of attorney for medical decisions does not grant authority to make financial transactions, Judge Brennan said. Yet these transactions occurred using credentials associated with that power of attorney. The court is referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of possible forgery and theft. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Daniel had stolen from Richard. Had forged signatures to funnel money out of Richard's accounts before he died? Veronica was standing now, her face a mask of professional calm, but her hands were shaking. Your Honor, my client has committed no crime. These transactions were Were what, Ms. Veronica? Judge Brennan's voice was sharp. Authorized? Then why were they hidden? Legitimate? Then why the shell companies and offshore routing? This court does not determine criminal culpability, that's for the district attorney, but this court does not ignore evidence of potential fraud when it's presented during litigation. He turned his attention back to Daniel, and his expression was one of barely contained disgust. Mr. Patterson, you came into this court claiming your mother had manipulated your father, had stolen what was rightfully yours. You painted yourself as the wronged son, the victim of an unfair will. But the evidence suggests you were actively stealing from your father before he even died. You were so certain you deserved his money that you couldn't even wait for him to pass away to take it. Daniel was standing now, his face ashen. Your Honor, I can explain. You'll have the opportunity to explain to law enforcement. Judge Brennan cut him off. In the meantime, this court orders that all assets transferred from Richard Patterson's accounts to Daniel Patterson's accounts in the 18 months before Richard Patterson's death be frozen pending investigation. Furthermore, given the suspicious nature of these transactions, this court is awarding Eleanor Patterson full control of the estate with no obligation to distribute any portion to Daniel Patterson until the criminal investigation is complete. He looked at me, and for the first time, something almost like sympathy crossed his face. Mrs. Patterson, I'm sorry you had to learn this way that your son was not only challenging your inheritance in court but may have been actively stealing from your husband before he died. The district attorney's office will be in contact with you. You may need to testify in any criminal proceedings that follow. The gavel came down one final time. We're adjourned. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters who'd been ignoring the case suddenly materialized from nowhere, cameras flashing. Blackwell was arguing frantically with the clerk about something. Veronica was pulling Daniel toward the exit, her grip on his arm almost violent. Barbara pulled me up from my seat. We need to leave. Now. Before the press realizes what just happened. But I couldn't move. I could only stare at Daniel as Veronica dragged him toward the doors. And just before he disappeared, he looked back at me. Our eyes met across that courtroom, and in that moment, I saw something I'd never seen before in my son's face. Fear. Real, genuine, bone-deep fear. And beneath it, something that might have been shame. Then he was gone, and Barbara was pulling me through a side door, down a hallway, into a service elevator that smelled like industrial cleaner. What just happened? I asked when I could finally speak. Did Daniel really? Did he steal from Richard? It looks that way, Barbara said grimly. And we didn't know about it because the transfers were so well hidden. They probably wouldn't have come to light at all except Judge Brennan is thorough. He has a reputation for digging into financial records personally in estate cases. He must have found the discrepancies when he was reviewing the estate inventory. $4 million, I said numbly. Daniel took $4 million from his father before Richard even died. And then had the audacity to come into court claiming you manipulated Richard, Barbara said, her voice hard with anger. He was projecting. He knew he'd stolen from his father, knew the will was legitimate, but he hoped that by attacking you, by claiming Richard was incompetent, he could create enough doubt to get the will overturned. And if the will was overturned, the theft might never have been discovered, everything would have been divided as part of the estate battle, and those missing millions would have just been absorbed into the chaos. We emerged from the courthouse through a loading dock, avoiding the reporters gathering at the main entrance. Barbara's car was waiting, and we drove away in silence. I felt nothing. Not triumph that I'd won. Not vindication that Daniel's case had fallen apart. Not even satisfaction that he'd been exposed as a thief and a liar. I just felt empty. Because this was it. This was the final, undeniable proof that my son was not the person I'd hoped he was, not the person I'd believed he could be. He hadn't just been distant or cold or resentful. He'd been willing to steal from his dying father and then blame me for the consequences. The boy I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through countless illnesses, drove to soccer practice and piano lessons and debate tournaments. That boy was gone, if he'd ever really existed at all. In his place was a man I didn't recognize, a man capable of theft and lies and breathtaking cruelty. When Barbara dropped me off at my house now, legally and unquestionably mine, she said, the district attorney will probably want to talk to you in the next few days. And Eleanor, you need to prepare yourself. This is going to get uglier before it gets better. Criminal trials are public. The media will be all over this. And Daniel will likely try to make you the villain somehow, claim you knew about the transfers, that you're trying to frame him. That's what desperate people do. I nodded, but I barely heard her. I walked into my house, into the silence and emptiness that had been my constant companion for months, and I went straight to Richard's study. I sat at his desk, opened his journal to a random page, and read, Daniel is who I made him. I taught him that love equals provision without presence, that success means always taking more, that family is secondary to ambition. I taught him to value money over relationships, winning over connection, image over truth. If he's become someone I don't recognize, someone I don't particularly like, I have no one to blame but myself. I closed the journal carefully and sat there in the dark, in the house that was now legally mine, in the life Richard had left me, a life of financial security and emotional devastation. And I thought, maybe Richard had known. Maybe Richard had suspected Daniel was capable of theft, of forgery, of using a power of attorney for medical decisions to steal millions. Maybe that's why Richard had written the will the way he did, not just to make amends to me, but to protect his assets from a son he no longer trusted. I'd never know for sure. Richard was dead, his secrets dying with him except for what he'd chosen to write down. But one thing was certain. The war was over, and I'd won. The question was, had I won anything worth having? If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Because this is where the story gets even more complicated. The trial was just the beginning. What came after, the investigation, the revelations, the final confrontation with my son, that's when I learned the truth about everything. Don't go anywhere. Check the description box for more stories like this, because you need to hear what happened next. The district attorney's office contacted me 2 days after the trial. A woman named Catherine Walsh, mid-40s with sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor, came to my house to explain what would happen next. We're opening a formal investigation into the transfers from your husband's accounts, she said, sitting in my living room with her briefcase open, papers spread across my coffee table. $4 million moved through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts over a 6-month period before your husband's death. The transactions were authorized using digital signatures linked to Daniel Patterson's power of attorney credentials. But Daniel's power of attorney was only for medical decisions, I said. Richard was very clear about that. He told me he didn't want anyone having control over his financial affairs while he was alive. Catherine nodded. Exactly. Which means either Daniel exceeded his authority and forged his father's signature on financial documents, or someone else used Daniel's credentials without his knowledge. We need to determine which. You think Daniel might not have done it? We investigate all possibilities. But the evidence points toward Daniel, at least preliminarily. The accounts receiving the money are in his name. The timing of the transfers suggests someone who knew Richard Patterson was dying and wanted to move assets before the death triggered estate proceedings. And the use of the medical power of attorney credentials suggests someone with authorized access to your husband's personal information. She pulled out a document. What I need from you is a complete picture of Richard's relationship with Daniel in his final year. Did Daniel visit frequently? Did he help with Richard's medical care? Did he have access to Richard's computer, his files, his passwords? I thought back to those final months of Richard's life. Daniel visited occasionally, I said slowly. Maybe once every few weeks. He'd stop by, usually on weekends, supposedly to check on his father. They'd sit in Richard's study for an hour or so, talking about business, I assume. I never intruded. Richard valued those visits, said it was nice to have someone to talk to about real estate and investments. Did you ever notice Daniel using Richard's computer during these visits? I don't know. I usually left them alone. I'd go to the kitchen or the garden, give them privacy. But yes, now that you mention it, I remember coming back once and Daniel was at Richard's desk, typing something on the computer. He said Richard had asked him to look something up. It seemed innocent at the time. Catherine made notes. Did Richard keep his financial passwords anywhere accessible? He kept a notebook in his desk drawer. Top right drawer, under some old tax documents. He wasn't good with technology. He wrote down all his passwords because he couldn't remember them. And Daniel would have known about this notebook. I don't know. Possibly. He'd been in that study many times over the years. Catherine closed her notebook. Mrs. Patterson, I need to be honest with you. Building a criminal case for forgery and theft is complicated, especially when the victim is deceased and can't testify about whether he authorized the transactions. We'll need forensic accountants, computer experts, handwriting analysts. It will take months, possibly over a year. And even then, Daniel's defense will likely argue that Richard gave him permission to move the money, that it was a gift or an early inheritance, and we can't prove otherwise because Richard isn't here to contradict that story. But Richard's will, the journal entries, they make clear he didn't want Daniel to have his money. They make clear Richard's state of mind when he wrote the will. But Daniel can argue that was different from Richard's state of mind 6 months earlier when the transfers occurred. He can claim Richard changed his mind multiple times, was confused, was manipulated by various people at different times. It becomes a he said she said situation, except Richard isn't here to say anything. I felt something cold settling in my chest. So Daniel might get away with it. It's possible. Or he might take a plea deal, return the money in exchange for reduced charges or no jail time. Or we might build a strong enough case to go to trial and win. Too early to say. She stood, gathering her papers. What I can tell you is that we're taking this seriously. Financial elder abuse, especially when it involves family members, is a priority for our office. We'll do everything we can to get justice for your husband. After she left, I sat alone in my living room, thinking about all those visits Daniel had made in Richard's final year. Visits I'd thought were motivated by concern, by a son finally trying to connect with his dying father. Had they all been about theft? Had Daniel been systematically moving money out of Richard's accounts while pretending to care about his father's health? I called Barbara and told her about the meeting. The good news, she said, is that the freeze on those assets means Daniel can't access that $4 million. Whether or not he's eventually convicted, you've effectively recovered that money for the estate. And with the judge's ruling, you control the entire estate. Daniel can't touch any of it. But he could still avoid criminal charges. He could. But Eleanor, think about what's already happened. Daniel's reputation is destroyed. Every business associate, every friend, every person in his social circle has read about this case by now. They know he sued his own mother, tried to claim his father was mentally incompetent, and got exposed as having stolen millions. Even if he avoids jail time, he'll carry this forever. That's its own kind of justice. Maybe. But it didn't feel like justice. It felt like devastation, like the complete collapse of whatever shred of family I'd had left. That night, I had a dream about Daniel as a little boy. In the dream, he was 7 years old, and we were at the park near our house. He was on the swing set, pumping his legs, calling out higher, Mom. Push me higher. And I was pushing him, watching him soar up toward the sky, his laughter echoing across the playground. In the dream, Richard appeared, standing at the edge of the playground in his business suit. He called to Daniel, "Come with me. I'll show you how to really fly." And Daniel jumped off the swing mid-arc, landed perfectly on his feet, and ran to his father without looking back at me. I woke up at 3 a.m. with tears on my face, understanding the dream's message immediately. I'd lost Daniel a long time ago. The theft, the lawsuit, the betrayal, they were just the final confirmation of something that had been true for decades. He'd chosen Richard's path over mine, chosen ambition and money and success over relationship and presence and love. And now he was paying the price for that choice, just as Richard had paid the price in his own way. The weeks following the investigation's announcement were brutal. The local papers picked up the story. Real estate heir accused of elder theft. One headline read, "Son sues mother, gets exposed as thief instead." Read another. My phone rang constantly with reporters wanting comments, distant relatives suddenly concerned about my well-being, former friends of Richard's expressing shock and offering insincere condolences. I stopped answering the phone. I stopped reading the papers. I stayed in my house, in the silence and solitude that had become my refuge, and I tried to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. Because I'd won. I had the house, the money, the validation that Richard had wanted me to have his estate. But I'd lost my son. And no amount of money could fill that void. One afternoon in late April, about 6 weeks after the trial, my doorbell rang. I almost didn't answer it. I'd learned that nothing good came from unexpected visitors. But something made me look through the peephole. It was Melissa Garner, the woman who'd brought me Richard's letter. I opened the door. "Melissa." She looked nervous, uncomfortable. "I'm sorry to just show up like this. I didn't have your phone number, and I needed to tell you something in person." I let her in, made tea, and we sat in the kitchen where I'd sat alone so many times before. "I've been following the news about the trial," Melissa said. About Daniel and the theft charges. And I remembered something Richard said to me, something I didn't think was important at the time, but now I think you should know. What is it? About 8 months before Richard died, maybe a year, he called me. We hadn't spoken in a long time. Our affair was over, we'd gone our separate ways. But he called me out of nowhere, and he sounded worried. He said he needed to talk to someone outside the family, someone who would be honest with him. I leaned forward. What did he say? He said Daniel had been asking a lot of questions about his finances. About the business, the accounts, the investments. At first Richard thought Daniel was just interested in learning about the family wealth, maybe planning for his own financial future. But then Daniel started asking more specific questions, about account numbers, about how to access certain funds, about Richard's passwords and security protocols. Richard said it felt off, like Daniel wasn't asking out of general interest but was gathering information for some specific purpose. My heart was pounding. Did Richard confront him about it? He said he tried. He asked Daniel directly why he needed so much detailed financial information, and Daniel got defensive. Said Richard was being paranoid, that he was just trying to be prepared to help manage things if Richard's health declined. They had a fight about it, one of the few real fights they'd ever had, apparently. And after that, Richard said Daniel backed off, stopped asking questions, but Richard still felt uneasy about it. Why didn't Richard change his passwords, lock down his accounts? I think he did, actually. He told me he was going to. But he was old, Eleanor. And sick. And maybe he didn't do it thoroughly enough, or maybe Daniel already had the information he needed before Richard could lock things down. I don't know. Melissa looked at me with genuine sympathy. What I do know is that Richard suspected something was wrong. He didn't want to believe his own son would steal from him, so he pushed those suspicions aside, told himself he was being paranoid. But somewhere deep down, he knew. And I think that's another reason he wrote the will the way he did, not just to make amends to you, but to protect his assets from Daniel. After Melissa left, I went to Richard's study and pulled out his journal again. I read through it more carefully this time, looking for any references to his concerns about Daniel and money. And there, in an entry from about 9 months before Richard died, I found it. Daniel was here today asking questions about my accounts. Very specific questions, too specific. He wanted to know about the offshore holdings, the shell companies I set up for tax purposes, the routing numbers for various accounts. He claimed he was trying to learn about estate planning for his own portfolio, but something felt wrong. The way he asked, the intensity of his focus, it felt like he was preparing for something. I told him I'd provide him with general information later but that I needed to protect my privacy. He got angry, actually raised his voice at me, which he almost never does. Called me paranoid and controlling. Maybe I am paranoid. Maybe I'm reading too much into his interest. But I changed my main passwords tonight anyway. Better safe than sorry. I hate that I'm suspicious of my own son. I hate that I've created a relationship where trust is so fragile, where I second-guess his motives. But I've spent my life around ambitious people, and I recognize that particular kind of hunger in Daniel's eyes. It's the same hunger I had when I was building my business, the hunger that makes you willing to bend rules, to cut corners, to prioritize winning above everything else. I taught him to be this way. And now I'm afraid of what he might do with the lessons I taught him. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. Richard had known. He'd suspected Daniel was planning something, had taken some steps to protect himself, but apparently not enough steps. And then he'd died before he could fully lock down his accounts or confront Daniel more directly. This changed everything. Because now I understood that the will wasn't just Richard's attempt to make amends to me. It was also his attempt to protect his assets from a son he no longer trusted. By leaving everything to me, Richard was putting the estate under the control of someone he knew wouldn't steal, wouldn't misuse the money, wouldn't betray his memory. He'd chosen me not just because I deserved it, but because Daniel couldn't be trusted. I called Catherine Walsh and told her about Richard's journal entry and what Melissa had shared. "This is excellent," Catherine said, her voice energized. "This establishes that Richard had concerns about Daniel's intentions regarding his finances, which undercuts Daniel's potential defense that Richard gave him permission to move the money. If we can show Richard was actively worried about Daniel accessing his accounts, it becomes much harder for Daniel to claim the transfers were authorized." Does this mean you'll definitely prosecute? It means we have a much stronger case than we did before. I'll need to get Richard's journal authenticated as evidence, same process as your attorney used for the civil trial. And I'll need to interview Melissa Garner. But yes, Eleanor, this significantly improves our chances of successfully prosecuting Daniel for theft and forgery. After I hung up, I sat in Richard's study surrounded by all his papers, his journal, his secrets, and I thought about how strange it was that Richard, distant, cold, emotionally unavailable Richard, had protected me even after his death. He'd left me the weapons I needed to fight Daniel's lawsuit. He'd left me evidence of his own failings and his regrets. He'd left me the truth, knowing the truth would be my shield. It was the most intimate thing Richard had ever done for me. And he'd had to die to do it. 3 months after the trial ended, on a hot July evening, my doorbell rang at 8 o'clock. I looked through the peephole and froze. Daniel was standing on my porch, alone. I should have called the police. Or at least called Barbara. Daniel was under investigation for theft and forgery. Showing up at my house could be considered witness intimidation or worse. But something in his posture, the way his shoulders slumped, the way he stood with his hands in his pockets like a child waiting to be punished, made me open the door. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked on that single word. We stood there looking at each other for a long moment. He'd aged dramatically in the months since the trial. There was grey at his temples I'd never noticed before, lines around his mouth, shadows under his eyes. He looked like Richard had looked toward the end, worn down by the weight of his own choices. "What are you doing here?" I asked. My voice came out harder than I'd intended, but I didn't soften it. I'd learned that softness with Daniel was a weakness he'd exploit. "I need to talk to you. Please. Just 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let him in. We didn't go to the living room. That felt too intimate, too much like family. We stood in the foyer, me with my arms crossed, him with his hands still in his pockets. "Veronica left me," he said finally. "Filed for divorce last week. Said she couldn't be married to someone under criminal investigation, that it was destroying her reputation at her firm." I felt a small, ungenerous surge of satisfaction. So there were consequences for Daniel after all, beyond legal troubles. His perfect life with his perfect wife in his perfect house, all of it falling apart. "I'm sorry," I said, and I was surprised to find I partly meant it. Whatever Daniel had done, watching your marriage collapse was painful. I knew that firsthand. "No, you're not. And you shouldn't be." Daniel looked around the foyer, at the expensive art on the walls, the crystal chandelier overhead, all the trappings of Richard's success. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About the trial, the accusations, everything. And I need to tell you the truth." My heart started pounding. "What truth?" "I took the money," Daniel said flatly, "from Dad's accounts. $4 million over 6 months. I used his passwords, his account information, his digital signature. I set up the shell companies and the offshore accounts to hide the transfers. It was all me." Even though I'd known, even though the evidence had made it obvious, hearing him admit it out loud was like being punched. "Why?" I managed to ask. "Because I thought I deserved it," Daniel said, and there was no defensiveness in his voice now, just exhaustion. "I thought Dad owed me. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn his approval, trying to be successful enough, impressive enough, worthy enough for him to actually see me. And it was never enough. He was always distant, always more interested in his next deal than in my life. And you," he stopped, took a breath. "You were always there, always trying to connect with me, and I hated you for it because it made me realize what I didn't have with Dad." I felt tears stinging my eyes but forced them back. I would not cry in front of him. Not now. "When Dad got sick," Daniel continued, "and I knew he was dying, I thought this was it. This was my chance to finally inherit something from him, to finally get the recognition I'd been chasing my whole life. The business, the money, the legacy, it would all be mine, proof that I'd been worthy all along. And then I started hearing rumors that Dad had changed his will, that he'd left everything to you. So you started stealing before he even died." I told myself it wasn't stealing. I told myself Dad would have wanted me to have it, that the will was a mistake, that you'd somehow manipulated him. I convinced myself I was just taking what was rightfully mine before you could get your hands on it. And then you sued me to get the rest. "Yes." Daniel's voice broke. I sued my own mother because I couldn't accept that Dad had chosen you over me. That even at the end, even after everything, he saw your value and my worthlessness. You're not worthless, I said automatically, and then hated myself for it. Even now, even after everything, the maternal instinct to comfort him was still there, a reflex I couldn't kill. I am, though. Or at least, I was. I was exactly what Dad made me. Someone who values money over relationships, winning over connection, image over truth. I became him, Mom. I became the worst parts of him. And now I'm paying for it. Daniel sank down onto the bottom step of the staircase, put his head in his hands. The district attorney offered me a plea deal. If I return the $4 million plus interest, plead guilty to 1 count of financial fraud, I'll get probation, community service, no jail time. My lawyer says I should take it. That going to trial is too risky, that I might end up in prison. Are you going to take it? I don't know. Part of me wants to fight it, to keep claiming Dad gave me permission, to drag this out as long as possible because admitting defeat feels like dying. But another part of me knows that's exactly the kind of thinking that got me here. The inability to admit when I'm wrong, the need to win at any cost. He looked up at me, and his eyes were red. I destroyed our relationship, didn't I? Whatever chance we had at being a real family, I destroyed it completely. I should have agreed with him. Should have told him yes, it was destroyed, he'd burned that bridge to ash and there was no rebuilding it. But instead I found myself asking, why did you hate me so much? What did I do that made you pull away? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You didn't do anything. That's what made it so infuriating. You were always there, always loving me, always trying. And I couldn't stand it because it made me realize how absent Dad was, how little he cared. It was easier to blame you for being too much than to admit Dad was giving me too little. I spent 40 years thinking I'd failed you somehow. You didn't fail me. I failed myself. I chose to model myself after Dad, the distance, the coldness, the prioritizing of success over connection. I thought that's what it meant to be a man, to be successful. And by the time I realized I'd chosen wrong, it was too late. The patterns were set. I didn't know how to be different. We sat there in the foyer, mother and son, separated by years of resentment and hurt and misunderstanding. Outside, the July evening was fading into dusk, cicadas singing their shrill song, the world continuing on like our family drama was just background noise to the universe's larger symphony. What do you want from me? I finally asked. Why did you come here tonight? I don't know, Daniel admitted. Maybe I wanted to apologize in person, where you could see my face and know I meant it. Maybe I wanted to confess before the plea deal made it official. Maybe I just wanted to see you one more time before I accepted that I'd ruined everything. You did ruin everything, I said quietly. But I ruined things too, Daniel. I should have stood up to your father more. I should have insisted he be present, be involved, be a real father to you instead of just a provider. I should have stopped making excuses for him, stopped protecting him. Maybe if I'd been stronger, our family would have been different. Or maybe it wouldn't have mattered, Daniel said. Maybe Dad was who he was, and I was who I was, and nothing you did could have changed any of it. He stood up slowly, like his bones ached. I'm going to take the plea deal. Return the money, plead guilty, accept the consequences. It won't fix anything, but at least it's honest. At least it's me finally admitting I was wrong instead of blaming everyone else. I nodded. That's probably wise. He walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. For what it's worth, Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for suing you, for stealing from Dad, for all the years I wasted being angry at you for things that weren't your fault. I'm sorry for not seeing you clearly until it was too late. I'm sorry too, I said. I'm sorry I couldn't give you what you needed. I'm sorry your father and I failed you in our different ways. I'm sorry our family became this. Daniel nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head, and then he left. I watched through the window as he got into his car and drove away, and I knew I might never see him again. Not because he was going to prison, he'd avoid that with the plea deal, but because there was nothing left to say, no relationship left to salvage. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Some damage is permanent. I went upstairs to my bedroom, to the bed I'd once shared with Richard, and I let myself finally cry. Not for Daniel as he was now, angry, bitter, criminal. But for Daniel as he'd been once, that little boy on the swing set, laughing as I pushed him higher. For the family we might have been if Richard had been different, if I'd been stronger, if Daniel had chosen connection over distance. I cried for all of it, the wasted years, the mutual failures, the love that had curdled into resentment and blame. I cried until I had nothing left, until I was empty and exhausted and somehow, finally, ready to move forward. Because there was nothing else to do but move forward. The past couldn't be changed. The future was all I had left. Daniel took the plea deal in August. The news reported it in a single paragraph buried in the local section. Local businessman pleads guilty to financial fraud, ordered to repay $4.2 million. No mention of the family drama, the will contest, the son stealing from his dying father. Just a dry recitation of facts, cleaned of all emotion and context. The $4 million plus interest and penalties was returned to the estate, which meant it was now mine to do with as I pleased. The judge's ruling was final. Daniel had no further claims to Richard's money, and the criminal conviction meant he was legally barred from inheriting anything from the estate even if I died without a new will. I had won completely. I had the house, the money, the moral high ground. I had everything I'd fought for. And I'd never felt more alone in my life. I started seeing a therapist in September, a woman named Dr. Helen Price who specialized in family trauma. I'd never been to therapy before. Richard had thought it was self-indulgent, and I'd internalized his view. But sitting in that big house every day with nothing but my thoughts and memories was driving me slowly crazy. I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me make sense of what my life had become. You're grieving, Dr. Price told me during our third session. Not just for Richard, not just for your relationship with Daniel. You're grieving for the life you thought you'd have, the family you hoped would exist. That's a complicated grief because you're mourning something you never actually had, only hoped for. How do you grieve for something you never had? I asked. The same way you grieve for anything else. You acknowledge the loss, you feel the pain, and you slowly learn to live with the absence. The difference is that with this kind of grief, there's often a lot of anger mixed in. Anger at yourself for hoping, anger at others for failing to meet your hopes, anger at the universe for not giving you what you deserved. She was right. I was angry. Furious, actually, in a way I'd never allowed myself to be before. Angry at Richard for being emotionally absent. Angry at Daniel for choosing cruelty over connection. Angry at myself for tolerating it all, for being so accommodating, for sacrificing my own needs to maintain the fiction of a happy family. What do I do with all this anger? I asked. You use it, Dr. Price said. Anger is energy. Right now it's eating you up inside, but if you channel it, if you direct it towards something productive, it can be transformative. You have resources now, money, time, freedom. What do you want to do with them? I'd never thought about it that way. For 42 years, my life had been defined by other people. Richard's career, Daniel's needs, the expectations of being Mrs. Richard Patterson. I'd never asked myself what I wanted, what mattered to me independent of my roles as wife and mother. I don't know, I admitted. I've never really thought about what I want. Then that's your homework. Think about it. Not what you think you should want, not what would make you look good or make other people happy. What you actually want. What would make your life feel meaningful? I spent weeks thinking about that question. I walked through my neighborhood, visited museums, sat in coffee shops watching people, trying to figure out what spark of desire still existed inside me underneath all the grief and anger and exhaustion. And slowly, an answer emerged. I'd spent my whole life being erased, by Richard's dominance, by Daniel's rejection, by my own willingness to make myself small and convenient. But I wasn't erased. I was still here, 63 years old with decades of life potentially ahead of me. And I had resources now to make a difference, to matter in ways I'd never been able to matter before. In October, I contacted a lawyer, not Barbara, who handled estates, but someone who specialized in non-profit organizations. I told her I wanted to start a foundation. What kind of foundation? She asked. Something that helps older women, I said. Women who've spent their lives taking care of everyone else and suddenly find themselves alone, with no identity outside their family roles. Women going through divorce after long marriages. Widows who don't know how to manage their own finances because their husbands controlled everything. Women whose children have abandoned them. I want to provide resources, therapy, financial planning, job training, community. I want to help women rebuild their lives after they've lost the identities they spent decades building." The lawyer smiled. "That's a beautiful mission. Have you thought about what you want to call it?" I had. I'd thought about it a lot. The Eleanor Patterson Foundation for Women's Independence. Not the Richard Patterson Foundation. Not the Patterson Family Foundation. My name. My mission. My legacy. We spent the next few months setting it up, filing paperwork, establishing board members, creating programs. I donated $10 million to get it started, money that would have made Richard apoplectic if he'd been alive. $10 million that could have gone to maintaining the family estate, to preserving his legacy, to ensuring the Patterson name remained associated with commercial real estate and business success. Instead, it was going to help women like me. Women who'd been made invisible by their marriages, dismissed by their children, told their sacrifices didn't matter. Women who deserved better than what they'd gotten. The foundation officially launched in January, exactly 1 year after Richard's death. We held a small event at a community center in downtown Philadelphia. Nothing fancy, nothing designed to impress the society crowd Richard had courted. Just women who needed help, volunteers who wanted to give it, and me, standing at a podium, speaking publicly about my life for the first time. "My name is Eleanor Patterson," I began, my voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word. "And for 42 years, I was invisible. I was a wife, a mother, a hostess, a manager of households and keeper of social calendars. But I was never really seen as a full person, someone with my own dreams and desires and value independent of my family roles." I looked out at the audience, maybe 50 women, ranging in age from their 40s to their 80s, all of them with that same look in their eyes. The look of women who'd spent their lives being told they didn't matter. When my husband died and left me his fortune, my son sued me for it. He believed I hadn't earned it, hadn't deserved it, that my 42 years of loyalty and sacrifice meant nothing compared to his entitlement as the male heir. And standing in that courtroom, listening to my own child testify that I was manipulative and excessive and demanding, I realized something. I'd spent my entire life apologizing for taking up space. Apologizing for needing love, for wanting connection, for daring to expect the people I sacrificed for to recognize that sacrifice. My voice was stronger now, filled with all the anger Dr. Price had told me to channel. "I'm done apologizing. And I'm creating this foundation so other women can stop apologizing too. We're going to provide resources, support, community, and most importantly, we're going to tell women that they matter. That their years of service matter. That their sacrifices matter. That they deserve to be seen, valued, and supported as they rebuild their lives." The applause started slowly, then built, women standing, some of them crying. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. Meaning. A sense that my life, my pain, my struggles could actually help someone else. In February, I did something I'd been avoiding for months. I drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. It was a cold, grey day, the kind of day that matched my mood. I walked through the rows of headstones until I found his, expensive marble, tastefully engraved, everything Richard would have wanted. "I won," I told him, standing there with the wind cutting through my coat. "I kept the money you left me. I used it to start something meaningful. And I'm finally living for myself instead of for everyone else." The wind rustled through the bare trees overhead. Richard, of course, didn't answer. "I don't hate you," I continued. "I did for a while. But I've realized you were just as trapped as I was, just in different ways. You were trapped by your ideas about masculinity, about success, about what it meant to be important. You built an empire but never learned how to build a relationship. And you paid for it. You died alone, really, even though I was there. You died knowing you'd failed at the things that actually matter." I knelt down, brushed some dead leaves off his headstone. "I'm sorry we couldn't figure it out while you were alive. I'm sorry we couldn't be real partners, real companions. I'm sorry Daniel became what he became. But I'm not sorry anymore for being who I am. For needing love and connection. For being present and demanding and, yes, sometimes too much. Because being too much is better than being nothing at all." I stood up, my knees aching from the cold ground. "Goodbye, Richard. Thank you for the foundation money. I promise I'll use it better than you ever would have." As I walked back to my car, I felt lighter somehow. Like I'd finally set down a burden I'd been carrying for decades. Richard was gone. Daniel was gone, at least from my daily life. The family I'd tried so hard to hold together had completely fallen apart. But I was still here. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. The foundation grew faster than I'd anticipated. By spring, we were helping 50 women through our various programs, financial literacy courses, therapy support groups, job training workshops, legal assistance for those going through divorces or estate battles. The women who came to us had stories that echoed my own in different ways. Women who'd given up careers to raise children, only to be divorced in their 50s and left with no work history. Women whose husbands had died leaving financial chaos and secret debts. Women whose children had abandoned them, viewing them as burdens or obstacles to inheritances. I met with every woman who came through our doors in those first few months. I wanted to hear their stories, wanted them to know that the foundation wasn't some abstract charity run by wealthy people who didn't understand their lives. I'd lived their experiences. I knew what it felt like to be erased, dismissed, considered worthless by the people you'd sacrificed everything for. In April, a woman named Patricia Donnelly came to one of our support groups. She was 61, recently divorced after 38 years of marriage, and her adult children had sided with their father in the split. She sat in the circle of chairs in our community room, crying as she told her story. "I gave him everything," she said, her voice breaking. "I raised 3 children essentially alone while he traveled for work. I managed every aspect of our home life, our social life, everything. And when he left me for his assistant, a woman 30 years younger, my children said I should have been a better wife. That I'd let myself go, that I was too focused on them and not focused enough on him. They're barely speaking to me now. I've lost my entire family." I reached over and took her hand. "You haven't lost yourself. And that's what matters most." She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "But who am I without my family? I've been a wife and mother for 40 years. I don't know how to be anything else." "Neither did I said. "And I'm still figuring it out. But I can tell you this, you're not starting from zero. You have 4 decades of skills. You know how to manage complex situations, handle multiple competing priorities, navigate difficult relationships, solve problems creatively. Those are the skills that make excellent employees, excellent entrepreneurs, excellent friends, and community members. You just have to learn to value them yourself, because your family taught you not to." Patricia came back week after week. Slowly, she started to rebuild. She took our financial literacy course and learned she had more assets than she'd realized from the divorce settlement. She took a part-time job at a local bookstore, something she'd always wanted to do but her husband had said wasn't worth her time. She made friends with other women in the program, built a support network that didn't depend on family approval. 6 months after first walking through our doors, Patricia stood up at one of our meetings and said, "I want to volunteer. I want to help other women the way this program helped me. Because Eleanor's right, we're not worthless just because our families treated us that way. We have value. We always had value. We just had to learn to see it ourselves." Stories like Patricia's kept me going through the hard days, the days when I still felt the ache of Daniel's absence, when I still woke up in the middle of the night wondering if I could have done something differently to save our relationship. Dr. Price helped me understand that wondering was natural but ultimately unproductive. "You can't control other people's choices," she told me. "Daniel made his choices based on his own damage, his own failures, his own inability to see you clearly. You could have been perfect, the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect everything, and it wouldn't have mattered. Because the problem wasn't you. It was never you." In June, 18 months after Richard's death, I got a letter from Daniel. It came to the foundation office, forwarded from the house, and I stared at it for a long time before opening it. "Dear Mom, I don't know if you'll read this. I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away without opening it. But I needed to write it anyway, needed to tell you some things I should have said a long time ago. I completed my probation in May. 2 years of community service, regular check-ins with my probation officer, restitution paid in full with interest. Veronica and I finalized our divorce. I sold the house, couldn't afford the mortgage without her income, and moved into a smaller place in Manayunk. It's strange being in a 1-bedroom apartment at 40 years old, but it's what I deserve. I've been going to therapy. A lot of therapy. Trying to understand why I became the person I became, why I made the choices I made. My therapist says I have what she calls attachment wounds, damage from childhood that affected every relationship I've had since. She says I learned to equate love with absence, to value the parent who was distant over the parent who was present, and that pattern shaped my entire adult life. I know this doesn't excuse what I did. Nothing excuses stealing from my dying father or suing my own mother or spending decades treating you like you were worthless. But it helps me understand it, which is the first step toward being different. I read about your foundation. I saw the article in the Philadelphia Inquirer about the work you're doing with older women. And I thought, that's who my mother really is. That's the woman I was too stupid and too damaged to see. Someone who takes pain and transforms it into purpose, who uses her resources to help others instead of hoarding them. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a relationship. I've destroyed whatever chance we had at that. But I wanted you to know that I see you now. Finally, too late, I see you clearly. And I'm proud of you, Mom. I'm proud of what you're building, proud of how you've refused to let what happened destroy you. I'm sorry. For all of it. For every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every year I wasted being angry at you for things that weren't your fault. I'm sorry I couldn't be the son you deserved. I hope you're happy. I hope you found peace. I hope the rest of your life is filled with people who value you the way I never did. Love. Daniel. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. It was everything I'd wanted to hear and nothing I could use. Because words were just words. Daniel was sorry now, after the damage was done, after the family was destroyed, after there was nothing left to salvage. But at least he saw me now. At least he understood, finally, what he'd lost. I put the letter in a drawer in my desk at the foundation office. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't respond to it either. Some bridges were too thoroughly burned to rebuild. Some relationships, once destroyed, needed to stay destroyed so both people could move forward. Instead, I threw myself into the foundation's work. We expanded our programs, opened satellite offices in 2 other cities, helped hundreds of women rebuild their lives after loss. I spoke at conferences, gave interviews, became a minor public figure in circles that cared about women's issues and elder rights. People started recognizing me sometimes. Aren't you Eleanor Patterson? The woman who started that foundation? And I'd smile and say yes, that's me. Not Richard Patterson's widow. Not Daniel Patterson's mother. Just me. Eleanor. A woman who'd spent 60 years being invisible and was finally, being seen. In September, 2 years after Richard's death, I did something I'd been thinking about for months. I sold the house in Chestnut Hill. It was too big, too full of memories, too much a monument to a life I didn't want to memorialize anymore. I bought a smaller place in Rittenhouse Square, a beautiful 2-bedroom condo with huge windows and a view of the park. A place that was mine, that I'd chosen, that had no history beyond what I'd create there. The day I moved in, I stood at those big windows looking out at the city, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Possibility. A sense that my life wasn't over, wasn't defined by the failures and losses of the past, but was actually just beginning in some important way. I was 65 years old. I had money, freedom, purpose, and time. I had a foundation that was changing women's lives. I had therapy that was healing old wounds. I had a future that was mine to shape however I wanted. Richard's money had bought me independence. Daniel's betrayal had forced me to find my own strength. And my own choices, to fight, to build, to refuse to disappear quietly, had given me a life worth living. I wasn't the woman I'd been when I married Richard at 21, full of naive hope and romantic delusions. I wasn't even the woman I'd been at the trial, frightened and defensive and desperately trying to prove I deserved to exist. I was someone new. Someone harder and softer at the same time. Someone who knew what it cost to be erased and refused to pay that price anymore. Here's to the next chapter, I said to myself, raising a glass of wine to my reflection in those big windows. Whatever it brings. 3 years after Richard's death, I was invited to speak at a national conference on elder financial abuse. The conference was in Washington, D.C., and the organizers wanted me to share my story, not just as a victim who'd fought back, but as someone who'd transformed personal trauma into systemic change through the foundation. I almost said no. Speaking to small groups at the foundation was one thing, but standing on a stage in front of hundreds of professionals, lawyers, social workers, financial advisors, advocates, felt overwhelming. But then I remembered something Dr. Price had said: your story has power. Not just to heal you, but to help others. You owe it to yourself to share it. So I said yes. The conference was in early October, 3 years almost to the day after Richard's death. I stood backstage in a convention center ballroom, listening to the moderator introduce me, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Our next speaker, the moderator said, is Eleanor Patterson, founder of the Eleanor Patterson Foundation for Women's Independence. 3 years ago, Mrs. Patterson's son contested her late husband's will, accusing her of manipulation and undue influence. During the trial, it was revealed that the son had actually stolen millions from his dying father. Mrs. Patterson not only won her case but used her inheritance to create a foundation that's helped over 300 women rebuild their lives after family betrayal and financial abuse. Please welcome Eleanor Patterson. The applause was thunderous as I walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, the audience vast, and for a moment I froze, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was about to do: tell my story, my shame, my pain, to strangers. But then I saw them. Women scattered throughout the audience, leaning forward in their seats, their eyes fixed on me with that look I'd come to recognize. The look of women who'd been where I'd been, who needed to know they weren't alone, who needed to know survival was possible. I stepped up to the microphone and began to speak. I told them everything. About marrying Richard at 21, about 42 years of emotional distance and loneliness. About Richard's affairs and my decision to stay anyway. About Daniel's gradual rejection, his coldness, his choice to value his absent father over his present mother. About the lawsuit, the accusations, the moment when I had to decide whether to fight or disappear quietly. I told them about finding Richard's journal, about learning that my husband had finally seen me clearly in his last years. About the trial, about sitting there while my son testified that I was excessive and demanding. About Daniel's theft being exposed, about winning everything and feeling like I'd lost it all. And I told them about the foundation, about choosing to transform pain into purpose, about helping other women find their value after decades of being told they had none. I spent my entire life believing that my worth came from serving others, I said, my voice echoing through the ballroom. From being a good wife, a good mother, a good woman according to everyone else's definitions. And when my son told me I was worthless, when he tried to take away the one thing my husband had left me, I believed him at first. I thought maybe he was right. Maybe I hadn't earned anything. Maybe my 42 years of loyalty and sacrifice didn't mean anything. I paused, looked out at all those faces. But I was wrong. And he was wrong. Our worth doesn't come from other people's recognition of our sacrifices. It doesn't come from being appreciated or valued by our families. It comes from within, from knowing what we've survived, what we've endured, what we've built even when no one was watching or caring. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. If you're sitting here today and you're going through something similar, if your family has dismissed you, stolen from you, treated you like you're worthless, I need you to hear this: you are not worthless. Your years of service, your sacrifices, your loyalty, they all matter, whether or not anyone acknowledges them. And you deserve to fight for yourself, to claim what's yours, to refuse to disappear just because it would be more convenient for everyone else. The applause started then, building into a standing ovation. Women were crying, some were cheering, and I stood there on that stage feeling something I'd never felt before: proud. Not proud of what I'd endured, but proud of who I'd become despite it. After the speech, dozens of women approached me, wanting to share their own stories, to thank me, to tell me the foundation had changed their lives. I listened to each of them, gave them my card, told them they mattered. One woman, maybe 70 years old with silver hair and fierce eyes, gripped my hand and said, "My daughter tried the same thing. Contested my husband's will, claimed I'd manipulated him. I've been so ashamed, like I did something wrong by fighting back. But hearing your story, I'm not ashamed anymore. I'm angry. And I'm going to use that anger the way you did." "Good," I told her. "Be angry. Channel it. Transform it. Don't let them make you small." That night, alone in my hotel room, I called Dr. Price. "I did it," I said. I told my story to hundreds of people. And it felt powerful. Like taking back control of my own narrative. "You've come so far," Dr. Price said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. 3 years ago you could barely say your husband had affairs without apologizing for mentioning it. Now you're standing on stages owning your entire story, shame and pain and all. I'm thinking about writing a book, I said. About everything that happened. About the marriage, the lawsuit, the foundation. Not as a sob story, but as a guide for other women. How to recognize financial abuse, how to fight back, how to rebuild. I think that's an excellent idea. Your story deserves to be told on your own terms. After we hung up, I stood at the hotel window looking out at the Washington Monument lit up against the night sky, and I thought about how strange life was. 3 years ago I'd been in a courtroom fighting for my survival, listening to my son try to destroy me, feeling like my entire life had been a waste. Now I had a foundation helping hundreds of women. I had a voice that people wanted to hear. I had a life that was mine, fully and completely, for the first time ever. Richard had given me the resources. Daniel had given me the motivation. But I'd done the work. I'd chosen to fight instead of fold. I'd chosen to build instead of collapse. I'd chosen to matter instead of disappearing. The next morning, as I was checking out of the hotel, my phone rang. Unknown number. But something made me answer. Mom. Daniel's voice. I hadn't heard it in over a year. Not since the letter I'd never responded to. Daniel, I said carefully. How did you get this number? I called the foundation. Told them it was urgent. I'm sorry if that was inappropriate, but I needed to talk to you. My hand tightened on the phone. What do you want? I saw your speech. Someone I know from the conference sent me a video link. And I watched it. All of it. His voice cracked. I watched you tell hundreds of people what I did to you, and Mom, I'm so sorry. I know I've said it before, but hearing you describe it from your perspective, understanding how much damage I did, I can't live with myself knowing I did that to you. I closed my eyes, leaning against the hotel lobby wall. Daniel, I can't do this right now. I can't comfort you about the guilt you feel for hurting me. That's something you need to work through on your own. I'm not asking for comfort. I'm asking for... He paused. I don't know what I'm asking for. Maybe just to tell you that I see you now. Really see you. And I'm sorry it took me 40 years to get here. I appreciate that, I said carefully. But seeing me now doesn't undo the decades you didn't see me. It doesn't repair the damage or rebuild the relationship. Some things, once broken, stay broken. I know. Is there any chance at all, that someday we might be able to talk? Not be mother and son like we were, but maybe just two people who share a history and want to move past it. I thought about it. Really thought about it. Part of me, the mother part that would never completely die, wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to grab onto any possibility of reconnect with my son. But I'd learned over these 3 years to listen to the other part of me, the part that knew boundaries mattered, that some relationships were toxic even when they were family. Maybe, I finally said. Someday. But not now. Not soon. I need more time, Daniel. I need to keep building my life without having to worry about whether you're going to hurt me again. I understand. He sounded like he was crying. I'll wait. However long it takes. And Mom, I really am proud of you. Of the foundation, of who you've become. You're amazing, and I'm sorry it took me losing you to figure that out. After we hung up, I sat in the hotel lobby for a long time, processing. Daniel had called. Had apologized again. Had asked for a chance at some kind of relationship in the future. And I'd said maybe. Not yes, not no. Just maybe. That felt right. I wasn't ready to forgive him completely, wasn't ready to invite him back into my life in any meaningful way. But I wasn't ready to close the door permanently either. Maybe someday, years from now, we could find some kind of peace with each other. Some kind of understanding that acknowledged the damage while leaving room for healing. Or maybe we wouldn't. Maybe I'd decide that living without him was healthier, happier, better. That was okay too. Because the most important thing I'd learned over these 3 years was that my worth, my happiness, my life, they didn't depend on fixing my relationship with Daniel or anyone else. They depended on me, on my choices, on my refusal to be erased. I flew back to Philadelphia that afternoon. My new condo was waiting, filled with furniture I'd chosen and art I loved. The foundation needed me. We had 3 new women starting our program next week, and I wanted to meet with each of them personally. My life was full. Different than I'd imagined at 21 when I'd married Richard, different than I'd hoped for during those lonely years of marriage, different than I'd feared during the lawsuit. But it was mine. Fully, completely, undeniably mine. And that, I'd learned, was enough. I'm 68 years old now, and I barely recognize the woman I was 5 years ago, sitting in that courtroom watching my son try to destroy me. That woman was scared, defensive, uncertain of her own value. This woman, the one I've become, is none of those things. The Eleanor Patterson Foundation has helped over 1,000 women now. We've expanded to 6 cities, and we're planning to go national within the next 2 years. I've written 2 books, one about my story, one a practical guide for women facing similar situations. Both became bestsellers, which still shocks me. Who knew that my pain, my struggle, my refusal to disappear would resonate with so many people? I've been on national television, given keynote speeches, testified before Congress about elder financial abuse. I've become, somewhat to my surprise, a minor public figure. People recognize me in airports, stop me to thank me, tell me their own stories. I've also started dating, which feels absurd and terrifying and thrilling all at once. His name is Robert Chen. Wait, I can't use Chen. Robert Morrison. He's 70, a retired professor of English literature, widowed for 5 years. We met at a bookstore, cliché, I know, and we've been seeing each other for about 6 months. He's nothing like Richard. Robert is present, emotionally available, interested in my work and my thoughts and my feelings. He reads the books I recommend, asks questions about the foundation, tells me I'm brilliant and amazing and beautiful in a way that makes me actually believe it. It's strange building a relationship at my age, strange learning to trust someone after everything I went through. But Dr. Price says it's healthy, says I deserve companionship and love and all the things I missed in my marriage to Richard. I still think about Daniel sometimes. Wonder how he's doing, whether he's happy, whether he ever really dealt with his damage or just learned to hide it better. We've exchanged a few emails over the years, brief, cordial, carefully neutral. He's remarried, apparently, to a woman who's a social worker. He says she's helping him understand the wounds from his childhood, helping him be different than he was. I'm happy for him, I think. Or at least I'm happy he's trying to change. But I've maintained my boundaries. We're not close. We probably never will be. And I've made peace with that. Last month, on the 5-year anniversary of Richard's death, I went back to his grave. The first time I'd been there since that cold February day 3 years ago when I'd said goodbye. The cemetery was beautiful in October, leaves turning gold and red, cool air, blue sky. I brought flowers, which felt absurdly traditional given our complicated history, but sometimes traditions exist for a reason. Well, Richard, I said, standing by his headstone, it's been 5 years. The foundation is thriving. I'm thriving. Your money is doing more good in the world than you probably ever imagined it could. A breeze rustled through the trees overhead, and I smiled. I'm not angry at you anymore. I was for a while, so angry I could barely think straight. But therapy and time and building something meaningful have softened that anger into something more like pity. You miss so much, Richard. You missed real connection, real intimacy, real partnership. You had all the success in the world and none of the joy. I knelt down, arranged the flowers in the little vase at the base of the headstone. I hope wherever you are, if you're anywhere, you've figured out what actually matters. I hope you've learned the lessons in death that you couldn't learn in life. And I hope you can see what I've built with your money. Not a monument to you, but a living, growing thing that's changing women's lives every single day. I stood up, my knees protesting slightly. I was getting older, feeling it in my joints and my energy levels, in the way my face looked in the mirror. But aging didn't frighten me the way it once had. Every wrinkle, every grey hair, every ache was proof that I'd survived. That I was still here, still fighting, still growing. Thank you for the journal, I said finally. Thank you for seeing me clearly at the end, even if you couldn't see me clearly during our marriage. Thank you for the will, for giving me the resources to build something that matters. And thank you for letting me go, in your way. For dying and releasing me from a marriage that was killing me slowly. I walked back to my car, and as I drove away from the cemetery, I didn't feel sad or angry or regretful. I felt free. That evening, Robert took me to dinner at a little Italian restaurant in South Philadelphia. We talked about books and politics and the Foundation's latest project, a scholarship program for women over 50 who wanted to go back to school. He listened when I talked, really listened, his eyes on my face, asking follow-up questions, treating my thoughts like they mattered. You're amazing, you know that? He said over dessert, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I'm really not," I said, but I was smiling. "I'm just someone who refused to disappear when everyone wanted me to." "That's what makes you amazing. Most people don't have that kind of strength." I thought about that. About the woman I'd been 5 years ago, terrified and defensive and uncertain. About the journey from there to here, from victim to survivor to advocate. About all the women I'd helped along the way, women who'd found their own strength by watching me find mine. "Maybe you're right," I said. "Maybe I am amazing. I think I'm finally starting to believe it." We went back to my condo after dinner, and we sat on my balcony overlooking Rittenhouse Square, drinking wine and watching the city lights, and I thought, this is what happiness feels like. Not the desperate, grasping happiness of someone trying to prove they deserve joy. Just quiet, solid, earned happiness. The kind that comes from knowing who you are, what you've survived, and what you've built. My phone buzzed with an email, a woman who'd just found the Foundation's website, asking for help. Her husband had died, her children were contesting the will, she felt lost and frightened and alone. I read her message and immediately wrote back, "You're not alone. We're here. I've been exactly where you are, and I'm going to help you get through this." Because that's what I do now. I help women find their strength, their value, their voice. I help them refuse to be erased. I help them transform pain into power, betrayal into purpose, ending into beginning. 5 years ago, I walked into a courtroom expecting my son to roll his eyes at me, expecting to be dismissed and denigrated and destroyed. And the judge, Judge Brennan, whose ruling changed everything, looked at me and saw someone worth defending. He saw through Daniel's lies and saw the truth, that I had value, that I deserved what Richard left me, that my years of loyalty mattered. That moment in the courtroom, when the judge ruled in my favor and then exposed Daniel's theft, that was the turning point. That was when I stopped being a victim and became something else. Something stronger. And now, 5 years later, I'm sitting on my balcony with a man who values me, running a foundation that's changing lives, living in a home I chose, building a future I designed. I'm 68 years old, and my life is just beginning. If you're watching this from wherever you are in the world, dealing with your own family betrayals or fighting your own battles for recognition and respect, I want you to know something: you can survive this. You can transform this. You can take the worst things that have happened to you and build something beautiful from the wreckage. It won't be easy. It will hurt. You'll cry, you'll rage, you'll question whether you have the strength to keep going. But you do. I promise you do. And on the other side of the pain, on the other side of the fight, there's a life waiting for you that's entirely yours. A life where you matter, where your voice is heard, where you refuse to be invisible. Take it from me, it's worth fighting for. Thank you for listening to my story. Check the description box below for resources, for more stories like mine, for information about the Eleanor Patterson Foundation. And remember, you are not worthless. You never were. You just had to learn to see your own value when everyone else refused to see it. Now go. Fight. Build. Survive. Thrive. Your life is waiting.